Close your eyes for just a moment and imagine being born into a world where the very first thing someone notices about you, before your fingers, before your face, is whether you are a boy or a girl. And if you are a girl, someone in the room sighs, not because they do not love you, but because they already know what your life is going to look like, and it is going to be hard, it is going to be small, and almost none of it is going to be your choice. Welcome back, everyone. If you're settling in tonight, finding your comfortable spot, maybe pulling a blanket a little closer, I am so glad you are here. Tonight we're going somewhere a long, long way from the present. We're going to medieval England, and we're going to spend some time with the women who lived there. Not the queens, not the saints, the ordinary ones, the ones history barely remembers by name. And I promise you their lives are going to surprise you in ways you did not expect. Tonight in part 1 we start at the very beginning. The girl who did not choose her own life. Let us set the scene. Medieval England. Roughly the year's 1066 when the Normans arrived and turned everything upside down through to about 1485, when the last of the Plantagenet kings fell at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Over 400 years. Dozens of generations of women, peasant women, noble women, merchant women, nuns, all of them living inside a world that had decided very firmly exactly what they were and exactly what they were for. Now here is something I think about whenever I read about this period. We have this habit, and I include myself in this, of imagining medieval women as essentially passive, as people who simply accepted their fate, who sat quietly in corners spinning wool waiting for life to happen to them. And the reality is both simpler and far more complicated than that. These women were not passive, they were not broken, but the world they moved through was built in ways that made almost every choice, who to marry, where to live, how to work, whether to speak, contingent on someone else's permission. It starts from the moment they are born. Here is something no history textbook really lingers on. In medieval England, the birth of a daughter was not celebrated the way the birth of a son was. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is not about parents not loving their daughters. Most parents did very much, but there was a social and economic reality hanging over every birth. A son could inherit land. A son could carry the family name forward. A son could work the fields with the father and take over when the father grew old. A daughter was, in the language of the time, a mouth to feed, until the day she became someone else's wife, and then she was someone else's responsibility to feed. The poet William Langland, writing in the 14th century in his great work known as Piers Plowman, painted a picture of peasant women that is almost painful to read. He described them burdened with children and the landlord's rent, waking in the night to rock the cradle carding and combing wool-patching clothes, washing laundry, spinning and spinning and spinning. He called it pity, this life of women in huts, and he was not wrong. But he was also only seeing part of the picture. Because that girl, the one born to the sigh, she was not going to stay small forever. She was going to grow up. And the world around her had very specific plans. By the age of 7 years old, a medieval girl's life had already divided into 2 very different paths depending on where she was born on the social ladder. If she was a peasant girl born into a family that worked the land, she was already working. Not heavy labour yet, not at 7. But she was chasing birds away from freshly planted seed in the fields. She was foraging for firewood and nuts at the edges of the forest. She was watching younger siblings while her mother cooked over the open fire in that single smoky room that served as bedroom, kitchen and living space all at once. She was learning to spin, which was not incidental, by the way. Spinning was how peasant households generated extra income. It was so central to a girl's identity that the word spinster, which we now use to mean an unmarried woman, literally came from this work. A girl who was not yet married was above all else a girl who was spinning. If she was a noble girl born into a family with land title wealth, Her childhood looked different on the surface. More comfortable, certainly, but not necessarily more free. Noble girls as young as 7 were commonly sent away from their own homes to live in the household of another noble family, often a family of higher rank. There she would learn how to manage a large estate, how to oversee servants, how to keep household accounts, how to plan meals for dozens of people, how to behave at court. She learned manners, music, embroidery, maybe a little reading. She was being trained essentially for the job she was going to spend the rest of her life performing, running a household, managing her husband's affairs, while he was away raising children who would be useful to the family's interests. Here is the detail that always stops me. She was doing all of this training for a household that was not yet hers in a home that was not her own, surrounded by people she had just met at 7 years old. Imagine that. Imagine being 7 and being sent to live with strangers, because that is simply what happened to girls like you. Now the question of marriage. This is where things get interesting and a little complicated, because the popular image of medieval marriage is often wrong in both directions. On one side, people imagine that medieval girls were constantly being forced into marriage at 12 years old against their will. On the other side, romantics like to imagine that even in medieval times love conquered all, and people married for affection. The truth has always lived somewhere in the middle and varied enormously depending on who you were. Canon law, that is the law of the Catholic Church, which governed almost every aspect of life in medieval England, set the minimum legal age of marriage at 12 for girls and 14 for boys. The Church also required, in theory, the mutual consent of both parties. You could not technically be married without agreeing to it. That sounds surprisingly modern, does it not? But here is the practical reality. For noble families, marriage was not a romantic arrangement. It was a political one. It was an alliance between families, a transfer of land and wealth, a way of securing loyalty or cementing peace after conflict. A girl's consent was legally required, but socially negotiable. If a girl's father had agreed to a match, if lands and dowry had been discussed and documents prepared, if an alliance hung in the balance, how much room really did a 12-year-old girl have to say no? There is a heartbreaking pattern in the historical record. Girls betrothed in childhood, sometimes to men they had never met, sent to live with their future husband's family years before the marriage itself took place. Growing up in a stranger's home, shaped and moulded into exactly the kind of wife that family needed. For peasant girls, the situation was different. Peasant marriages were simpler affairs with far less property to negotiate, and because peasants had so little, the Church's requirement of mutual consent actually carried more weight in practice. Peasant couples often chose each other not freely in the modern sense, but with considerably more agency than their noble counterparts. Some historical records suggest that many peasant couples simply lived together and were recognized by their community as married without ever having a formal church ceremony at all. Because without property to transfer, the legal formality mattered less. And the average age of marriage for most women, not the noble girls who were sometimes pushed into early matches, but the majority of English women, was actually in the late teens to mid-20s. That surprises people. We have this idea that everyone in the Middle Ages was married off as a child, and it was simply not true for most people. But let us talk about something that is almost never discussed when people talk about medieval girlhood, and that is what a girl was actually learning, and what those skills meant. We have this tendency to look at spinning, weaving, cooking and brewing, the skills medieval girls were taught from childhood, and see them as small things, domestic things, unimportant things, but they were not. They were the entire economic foundation of the medieval household. A woman who could brew ale was not just doing a chore. She was producing a commodity that the entire community depended on, because clean water was unreliable, and ale, even weak low-alcohol ale, was safer to drink. A woman who could spin and weave was not just making clothing. She was producing goods that could be sold, traded, used to pay rent. A woman who could manage a household, who could keep track of food stores, organize labor, negotiate with merchants, plan for the winter, was performing work of extraordinary complexity and consequence. The problem was not that the work was unimportant. The problem was that the world around these women refused to recognize that importance with anything concrete, not legal rights, not equal pay, not the kind of public respect that would have preserved their names in the historical record. They did the work, the world used the work, and then largely forgot to write their names down. There is one more thing I want to sit with before we move on. Historians used to argue, and some still do, that medieval people did not love their children the way we do today. That high rates of infant death made parents emotionally distant, unwilling to invest too deeply in a child who might not survive. That childhood itself was not really recognized as a distinct phase of life. I find this argument increasingly hard to believe the more time I spend with the actual historical evidence. Parents in medieval England named their children, baptized them within days of birth, bought them toys, actual toys including little dolls made of wax and wood and cloth and rocking horses painted in bright colours. They mourned them when they died, sometimes in language of such raw grief that it reaches across 7 centuries and still feels like a wound. A father in the 13th century recorded in a coroner's inquest had been watching his young daughter play near the village well when she fell in. The official record is dry and procedural, but between the lines you can feel what it was, a man watching helpless, as something irreplaceable was taken from him. These were not distant parents. They were people trying to love their children inside a world that gave them very little help in doing so. And for daughters specifically, there was perhaps something else in that love, something complicated. A father who wanted better for his girl but could not give it to her. A mother who taught her daughter to spin and cook and manage a household, not because she thought those things were all her daughter was worth, but because those were the skills that would keep her alive. The girls who grew up in medieval England were not born into freedom. They were born into a specific shape that the world had already cut out for them, and then for the rest of their lives they lived inside it and around it, and sometimes quietly against it. How they did that, how they worked, how they loved, how they survived, how some of them even found ways to carve out something that looked like power inside a world that did not plan to give it to them, that is what the rest of this series is about. And we are just getting started, because right after this we're going to look at something that most people have never heard of, a legal doctrine that on the day a woman got married made her legally disappear. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, legally. As if she had never existed at all. It had a name, and it shaped the lives of women in England for centuries. We're going to take it apart and see exactly how it worked, and why in some strange ways it was even more complicated than it sounds. Stay with me. Something I keep coming back to the more time I spend reading medieval history is how often the most important things are hidden inside the most ordinary-looking words. Take the word covered. In French, the language the Norman rulers of England brought with them, after 1066 the word is couvert, covered, protected, sheltered under something larger than yourself. And on a cold English morning in the 1300s when a woman walked to the church door and said her wedding vows, that is exactly what happened to her legally speaking. She became covered. She stepped under the roof of her husband's legal existence, and from that moment forward she more or less ceased to exist as a person in the eyes of the law. They had a name for it. They called it coverture, and tonight that is what we are going to take apart. I want you to think about something for a moment. Think about what it means to be a person in a legal sense. Not in a spiritual sense, not in an emotional sense, in the cold, practical, very real consequences sense. It means you can own things. It means you can sign contracts. It means you can sue someone if they wrong you and you can be sued. It means when you walk into a courtroom, you exist. Now imagine that on the day you got married, all of that disappeared, not metaphorically, not sort of, actually disappeared, absorbed, folded, dissolved into someone else's legal identity the way a small river disappears when it flows into a larger one and loses its own name. That is a line from an actual legal commentary of the time, by the way. A 17th century jurist named Sir Thomas More wrote about a wife whose legal self was like a small brook flowing into the Thames. The river kept going, the brook simply ceased to be. And he wrote it entirely without irony. This was simply how things were. The medieval legal treatise known as Bracton, written in the 13th century, the closest thing England had to a formal legal textbook, for generations spelled it out plainly. Husband and wife, it declared, are one person in law, one flesh and one blood, and that single unified legal person was without any ambiguity the husband. She had been absorbed. Now let me make this concrete, because it is one thing to talk about legal philosophy, and quite another to understand what it meant on a Tuesday morning when a woman needed to do something. Under coverture, a married woman in medieval England could not own property in her own name. Any land, any goods, any money she'd brought into the marriage, it became his. Any wages she earned, his. Any inheritance that came to her from a dead relative, his. If she worked in the fields from sunrise to sunset and someone handed her a coin, that coin technically belonged to her husband. She could not sign a legal contract. She could not take anyone to court in a civil case. She could not run a business in her own name. She could not write a legal will and have it honoured. She literally could not make a promise that the law would recognise, because she herself was not a legal person the law recognised. And here is the detail that I find most striking. If she committed a crime, not a serious crime, but a minor offence, say selling ale at the wrong price, or getting into a dispute in the marketplace, the fine was charged to her husband. Because legally she had acted under his authority. She was in the most profound sense his responsibility as property, and his liability all at once. Think about what that feels like from the inside. You are a grown woman. You have run a household, raised children, managed crops through bad harvests and worse winters. You have more practical knowledge about how to keep a family alive than most men will ever accumulate. And the law treats you as if you cannot be trusted to sign your own name. Let me pause here because I want to be fair about something. And this is where medieval history gets genuinely complicated rather than simply grim. Coverture on paper and coverture in practice were two different things. And the gap between them is important. The medieval legal system was not one single machine. There was common law, the English legal tradition that coverture lived in. And then there were other courts, church courts, equity courts, manorial courts, borough customs, and these different systems did not all agree with each other. In certain towns, London most famously, there existed a remarkable custom that allowed married women who ran businesses independently from their husbands to register as what was called a sole merchant. A woman in this category could trade-make contracts, own business property, and be sued for her business debts entirely separately from her husband. It was called feme sole status as opposed to feme covert, the uncovered woman rather than the covered one. This sounds like a significant escape hatch, and for some women it genuinely was. A silk woman named Alice Claver is one of the most vivid examples we have. She was a London trader who became one of the most successful silk merchants of the 15th century, regularly supplying fabric to the royal household of King Edward IV. After her husband died in 1456, she achieved full feme sole status as a widow, and she never remarried. She ran her business, trained female apprentices, and when she died in 1489 she left charitable donations specifically earmarked to help poor women fund their dowries. She was quietly, deliberately building something opportunity for women who came after her. Alice Claver is the kind of woman history almost never writes about. But she was real and she mattered. However, and this is important, I do not want to let the existence of Alice Claver create a misleading impression. Because historians have looked very carefully at the records of medieval English courts, and the actual number of married women who formally registered as feme sole merchants was remarkably small. The legal option existed. Very few women used it. And when historians have tried to find out why, they have uncovered something rather uncomfortable. Feme sole status had a catch. More than one, actually. If you registered as a sole merchant and your business incurred debts you could not pay, you were personally liable. You could be imprisoned for those debts. Your husband could not be held responsible. For a married woman who had no independent assets, no access to credit markets on equal terms with men, fewer business contacts, and an enormous amount of domestic work still expected of her. In addition to any commercial activity, the legal freedom came with a very real financial danger attached. There is an actual case that has survived in the records from the late medieval Chancery Court, a woman named Joan, whose husband had borrowed money from a creditor named Thomas. When the husband could not pay, Thomas had Joan thrown into prison claiming she was the one who had contracted the debt as a sole merchant. Joan's petition written from prison survives. In it she says almost poignantly that she had never identified herself as a sole merchant, never even knew what the term meant until that moment. And yet there she was in a cell because her husband's creditor had found her a convenient target. That case captures something important. The legal framework was flexible enough in theory to offer women some agency, but it was also flexible enough to be weaponized against them, and a woman without wealth, without connections, without a powerful family behind her, she was almost always the one who lost. So how did ordinary married women actually navigate this? Because most of them were not London silk merchants. Most of them were not wealthy widows with connections at court. Most of them were peasant women, or townswomen of modest means trying to live their lives inside a system that officially did not fully acknowledge their existence. The answer, I think, is that they navigated it the way people have always navigated systems that do not serve them quietly, practically, creatively, and without leaving much of a written record. Historians who have studied medieval manorial court rolls, those are the records kept by local landlords' courts, the kind of court that handled everyday disputes in villages all across England, have found that married women show up in them constantly, not as the principal parties in major lawsuits but as witnesses, as participants in local commerce, as people negotiating debts and making small deals, and occasionally standing up in court to argue their own cases in matters that affected their households directly. The formal law said one thing. The reality of daily life in a village said something somewhat different. There were marriages where the husband genuinely treated his wife's work and judgment as an equal partnership, not because the law required it, but because it made practical sense. Running a medieval farm or a small trade required two people, often more. A husband who refused to acknowledge his wife's contributions was a husband whose household was likely to fail. And there were marriages, of course, that were miserable. Coverture gave a husband enormous power over a wife who had nowhere to go and no legal recourse if he chose to use that power badly. The church could theoretically intervene in cases of extreme cruelty. In practice, the bar was very high, and most women in difficult marriages simply endured. This is the uncomfortable truth at the centre of coverture. It was not experienced uniformly. It depended entirely on the character of the man a woman happened to marry. A good marriage could feel like partnership. A bad one could feel like and functionally be something not far from captivity. And a woman had very little say in which one she got. There is a broader point here that I find myself thinking about often when I read this material, and it is this coverture did not just affect individual women's daily lives, it shaped the entire structure of what was possible for women as a group. When you cannot own property, you cannot accumulate capital over generations. When you cannot sign contracts, you cannot build businesses that outlast you. When your legal identity dissolves into your husband's, your contributions are attributed to him. In the records, your name disappears from the documents, and 400 years later, a historian trying to understand your life has to piece it together from the shadows you left in other people's records. That is not just a personal injustice, it is a systematic one. It explains why medieval women's economic contributions were so profound and yet so invisible. It explains why we know the names of so few of them. It explains why the history of medieval England can so easily be told as if women were barely there because the legal system was specifically designed to make them barely visible. And here is what I find genuinely striking about all of this. Something I think we do not talk about enough. Coverture did not end in medieval England. It lasted. It persisted through the Tudor period, through the Stuarts, through the Georgians, all the way into the 1800s. The Married Women's Property Act, which finally gave English wives the right to own their own property, was not passed until 1882. Almost 600 years after the Norman legal reforms that had baked coverture into the English common law in the first place, and in certain American states the legal remnants of coverture were still being challenged in courts into the 1970s. That is worth sitting with for a moment. The legal doctrine that erased a medieval English woman's identity on her wedding day was not fully dismantled within living memory. I want to end this part with something that I find unexpectedly quite moving. The women who lived under coverture in medieval England mostly did not know the word. They did not have legal theory to explain why their lives were shaped the way they were. They simply lived inside it, working, managing, loving, surviving, sometimes finding ways to carve out a little space for themselves, sometimes not. Most of them never got to choose much, but they got up every morning and did what needed to be done, and occasionally one of them, an Alice Claver, a widow who managed to get her name into the royal household accounts, a Joan who wrote a petition from prison, insisting that she had done nothing wrong, one of them left a mark. Not because the system made space for her, but because she refused in her own small way to entirely disappear. That stubbornness, I think, runs like a quiet thread through all of what we're going to talk about in this series, and it is about to show up in the most unexpected place, because next we are stepping outside. We're going to spend a full day alongside a peasant woman in medieval England from before the sun rises until well after it sets, and I promise you what she actually did with those hours is going to challenge almost everything you thought you knew about who was doing the real work. Picture this. It is somewhere around 3 a.m. The English countryside is completely dark, no streetlights, no phone screens, no distant hum of traffic. Just the kind of thick, total darkness that most of us have never actually experienced. And somewhere in a single-room cottage in a village in 14th century England, a woman opens her eyes. She does not lie there debating whether to get up. There is no debate. There is never a debate. She just gets up. And what follows every hour of that day, from that cold, dark beginning until long after the sun goes down again, is something that I think modern people almost completely fail to imagine correctly. Not because we lack imagination, but because we've been told for a very long time a story that is simply not true. The story goes like this: medieval women stayed home. They cooked, they cleaned, they had children, and they waited for men to come back from doing the real work. The world outside the cottage was men's territory. The world inside was women's, and that world was small, quiet, and not very important. I want to spend some time today demolishing that story, because the historical evidence does not support it. Not even a little. Let us start with that 3 a.m. wake-up, which, yes, is documented. Medieval life was organised entirely around natural light, and in summer, when the days ran long and the farming calendar was relentless, a workday could begin before the sky showed any sign of lightening at all. The first thing she does is restart the fire. Last night's embers, carefully banked to stay alive through the night, need coaxing back into a proper flame. The cottage has one room. The fire in the centre or against one wall is everything. It is warmth. It is light. It is the engine that will produce the family's food. Getting that fire going properly is not a casual task. It requires skill, patience, and the kind of intimate knowledge of your own fire that only comes from tending it every single day of your life. While the fire catches, she starts the morning's pottage. Now, if you've never heard that word before, pottage was essentially a thick porridge or stew, the foundational food of the medieval peasant diet. It might have oats, barley dried peas, whatever vegetables the garden had provided flavoured with herbs she had dried herself during the summer. It was not exciting food, but it was calorie-dense and warming, which was what you needed when you were about to spend the next 12 hours doing physical labour. The pottage goes into the pot goes over the fire, and she moves on to the next task, the chickens. Almost every peasant family kept chickens, and the historical record is quite clear that chickens were considered the woman's responsibility. She lets them out of whatever shelter they have been kept in overnight. She feeds them. She collects whatever eggs have been laid. And here is a detail I find quietly fascinating. Those eggs were not just breakfast. Eggs were currency. They could be given as partial payment to the lord of the manor for the family's various dues and obligations. An egg was a tangible, tradable unit of economic value. And the woman who raised the chickens, collected those eggs and decided where they went, was exercising real economic decision-making, even if nobody at the time would have described it that way. Now here is where I want to gently challenge something that I think most of us assume without realising it. When we picture medieval farm work, ploughing, sowing, harvesting, the heavy work of the agricultural year, we tend to picture men. The farmer in the field, the peasant with his scythe. And there were certainly tasks that men performed more than women. Ploughing with oxen was primarily men's work because it required managing large animals over long distances in a sustained way that was difficult to combine with infant care. But here is what the historical evidence actually shows: women did almost everything else. Medieval manuscripts from the 13th and 14th centuries, those beautifully illustrated calendar pages that monasteries produced showing the labours of each month of the year, depict women doing things that would surprise most modern viewers. A woman with shears crouched over a sheep shearing its wool with confident, practised hands. A woman carrying a sack of grain on her back walking toward a waiting boat at a river dock. Women digging with spades in a cathedral garden. Women reaping the harvest with sickles side by side with men cutting the stalks and binding them into sheaves. This was not occasional or exceptional. This was ordinary. During harvest time, especially those crucial weeks in late summer, when every stalk of grain had to be cut before rain could ruin it, women were an essential part of the labour force. The entire community, men and women, both went to the fields. Because if the harvest failed, everyone starved. There was no gendered exemption from that reality. And one historical detail I find particularly striking: wage records from the 14th century show that when women were hired as agricultural day labourers, they were typically paid less than men for the same work, sometimes around 75% of a man's wage. That is its own injustice, absolutely, but it also tells us something important. Women were being hired for agricultural wage labour, in large enough numbers that someone kept records of what they were paid. The work was real, the scale was real, and the economic exploitation was real. Let us come back to the cottage for a moment, because there is so much happening there that I want to walk through properly. Mid-morning. The pottage has been eaten. The children have been organised into their various tasks. Small children were put to work early in medieval households, chasing birds away from newly sown fields, fetching water from the well, watching the family's livestock on the common land outside the village. The older ones, if the family was fortunate enough to have them still at home, might be out helping in the fields. She is spinning. I say this not as a metaphor, but as a literal description of what she is probably doing with any quiet moment in her day. The distaff stick used to hold unspun fibre, and the spindle which twisted the fibre into thread as it was dropped and turned. These were objects so inseparable from a woman's identity in medieval England that they became the defining symbol of the female sex. Medieval heraldry used the spindle as the distaff side, the feminine lineage of a family. As we touched on in an earlier part of this series, the word spinster quite literally means a woman who spins. But why was spinning so constant, so relentless, so much a part of every spare moment of a woman's day? Because wool was England's primary industry. Woolen cloth was what England sold to the rest of the world. The export of wool and woolen cloth generated wealth that built cathedrals, funded wars, and made merchants rich. And at the very beginning of that production chain, at the first and most labour-intensive step, were women combing the raw wool, spinning it into thread, sometimes weaving it on simple household looms. A woman who was skilled at this could use the thread her household produced to clothe her family without buying cloth from the market. And any surplus could be sold. One medieval poem, a ballad that historians sometimes call the tyrannical husband, written in the 15th century, describes a wife who tells her husband that through her weaving of a bit of linen cloth over the course of the year, the family had saved enough to avoid buying cloth at all. Her husband dismisses this as nothing. He is, as the poem makes clear, wrong. Let me tell you about the brewing now, because I think it deserves its own moment, even though we are going to explore it more fully in a later part of this series. Every 2 weeks, roughly, a medieval peasant woman brewed ale. This was not optional recreation. This was food production. Ale, low alcohol, grain-based, often barely fermented by modern standards, was the safe drinking option for a household that could not reliably trust its water supply. Children drank it. Old people drank it. Everyone drank it morning and evening in the same way we might drink water or juice. And it was the woman who made it. The process was physical and demanding. She needed to malt the grain, soak it, allow it to germinate, then dry it. She needed large vats of hot water, which meant carrying them. Brewing historian Judith Bennett, who has written extensively on this subject, found a coroner's inquest record from October 1270. That is to say, a document recording someone's death, in which 2 women named Amice and Sybil were carrying a 12-gallon vat of hot liquid in a brewhouse when one of them slipped and fell into the vat. That account, dry and procedural as it is, captures the sheer physical scale of what medieval women were doing. These were not small pots on a kitchen counter. These were heavy industrial containers of scalding liquid carried by hand. And yet, because brewing happened inside the home, because it was classified as domestic work, it was invisible to the people who wrote history. Right up until quite recently, historians tended to assume it was a minor activity. The actual records tell a completely different story. By afternoon, she might be in the garden. Medieval peasant household maintained kitchen gardens, small plots immediately adjacent to the cottage, where they grew vegetables and herbs. Cabbages, onions, leeks, peas, garlic, parsley, sage, mint, thyme. These were not decorative gardens, they were survival gardens, and they were again primarily the woman's domain to manage. But here is something that most modern people would never think to ask: what happened to the surplus? If the garden produced more than the family could eat, what did she do with it? She sold it. At the weekly market, if the village was large enough to have one, from a basket carried to a nearby town, traded to a neighbour in exchange for something the family needed. Medieval women were active participants in the local market economy, in ways that the formal historical record almost entirely ignores, precisely because their transactions were small, informal, and not the kind of thing that generated written documentation. But they were real, and they mattered not just to the individual household, but to the functioning of the entire local economy. A cheese she had made from the family cow's milk, a bundle of dried herbs, half a dozen eggs. These things moved through the village constantly, woman to woman, house to house, in an informal economic network that kept communities functioning between the larger formal markets. I want to stop here and address something directly, because I suspect some of you might be thinking, yes, but all of this work was still ultimately in service of the household. Was it really so different from what we would expect? And my honest answer is, it depends what comparison you are making. Compared to the image of medieval women as passive domestic and economically marginal, yes, dramatically different. The evidence shows women who are physically active, economically productive, and managing complex multitask workloads that combined field labour, food production, textile production, animal husbandry, childcare, and market participation simultaneously. That is not small, that is not marginal. But compared to the freedom of a medieval man who performed similarly demanding work, no, not the same at all. A medieval woman's labour built the household, but she could not legally own the household. She could earn money through her chickens and her cheese and her spinning, but legally that money belonged to her husband. She could be the most economically productive person in the village, and she would still be paid less when she worked for wages excluded from formal guild membership and written out of the official record. There is a particular phrase that I keep returning to from historian Barbara Hannawalt, who has written some of the most careful work on medieval peasant women. She described the medieval peasant household as a unit of economic production, in which the husband and wife were in practical terms genuine partners, each contributing essential, irreplaceable skills to the joint enterprise of keeping the family alive. And yet she noted the partnership was not equal. The man's name was on the land. The man's name was in the court rolls. The man's voice was heard in the village assembly. The woman's contribution was constant, essential, and structurally invisible. That asymmetry between contribution and recognition is one of the things that runs deepest through the entire history of medieval women. And the more closely historians look at the actual evidence, the more stark it becomes. Let me close this part with something I find genuinely lovely amid all the difficulty. There is a tradition that historians have traced in medieval villages of women gathering together to spin in the evenings. Not individually in their own cottages, but communally, neighbours coming to one house bringing their distaffs and spindles, sitting together by firelight, working and talking, telling stories, singing sometimes. There is even evidence of these gatherings in some regions being associated with a patron saint with a particular night of the year, when the spinning groups would meet with a kind of ceremonial quality to them. It was still work. It was still unpaid, invisible, economically essential labour. But it was also a moment of community women creating something together in a space that is genuinely theirs, talking about whatever they wanted to talk about while their hands kept moving. I think about that image sometimes. The firelight, the thread moving through practiced fingers, the sound of voices. Women who had been up since 3 a.m, who had milked the cow and fed the chickens and stirred the pottage, and gone to the fields and come home and started the evening meal, carving out one small hour that belonged just slightly to them. That hour matters. Not because it was enough. It was not enough. But because it existed at all, because even inside a world that extracted so much from them, they still found a way to make something that felt like their own. And speaking of things that were very much their own, in our next part we're going to step inside one of the most surprising economic success stories of medieval England. Because there was one industry that women did not just participate in, they ran it. They owned it. They were so dominant that the records treated it as almost exclusively female until something changed. And what changed tells us everything about how power actually works, right? So we ended the last part by talking about women gathering to spin in the evenings, that rare pocket of time that was just slightly their own. But what if I told you there was one trade, one specific, underappreciated, wonderfully smelly industry, where medieval women did not just participate, did not just carve out a small pocket for themselves, but actually ran the whole thing? What if I told you that for much of the medieval period, the drinking culture of England, every jug of ale that every farmer, every monk, every lord and his servants knocked back at the end of a long day was almost entirely in women's hands? And what if I then told you that men took it away from them, not by working harder, not by being better at it, but by using the exact tools we talked about in Part 2 Law Capital Social Status, and when all else failed, pure reputation destruction? Here is the story of the Alewives, and I warn you it is going to make you furious in the most interesting way. Let us start at the beginning. Ale in medieval England was not a luxury. It was not what you drank at the pub on a Friday night after a rough week. It was a staple food. It was nutrition. It was hydration. In a country where the water supply in most towns and villages was genuinely unsafe, contaminated by animal waste-rotting matter. Runoff from the streets, ale was what kept people alive. Adults drank it. Children drank it. Monks drank it. It has been estimated that a typical person in medieval England might consume up to a gallon of ale per day, though much of this was what people called small ale, a very lightly fermented grain drink low in alcohol, closer to modern non-alcoholic beer than to anything you would order at a bar today. The key thing to understand about medieval ale as opposed to modern beer is that it had no preservatives, no hops, which were only introduced into England from the Netherlands and Belgium in the late 15th century. This meant that ale went sour within days of being brewed. You could not make a large batch and store it. You had to produce it constantly in small quantities, fresh and local, and that created a perfect opening for women. Because constant small batch production of ale did not require a dedicated factory. It did not require expensive specialized equipment that only the wealthy could afford. It required the tools that every peasant household already had: large pots, vats, ladles, straining cloths. The same tools used for cooking, the same space already managed by the woman of the house. It was, as historian Judith Bennett has observed, a natural extension of the domestic responsibilities women already held. You were already producing food. You were already managing the fire. You were already feeding a family. Adding ale production was not a leap. It was a step. So women brewed, and then they sold what they had made in excess, and then gradually some of them got quite good at it, and before long the evidence is clear women were not just participants in the ale trade of medieval England, they were the ale trade. Let me give you some actual numbers, because this is the kind of thing that really lands when you see the data. In the Midlands village of Brigstock, which has been studied in detail because of its unusually complete manorial records, the court rolls from the early 14th century show that virtually all the presentments, the formal notices from the ale tasters, the officials who were responsible for checking that ale met the required standard of quality and price, were against women. Not a handful of women. The overwhelming majority of commercial brewers in Brigstock who are recorded in the court rolls were female. The records treated brewing almost as if it were by definition female work. Across England around 1300, Judith Bennett's research found that in most villages somewhere between a dozen and 24 women were actively brewing ale for sale in any given year. In larger towns that number could reach 100. These were not casual hobbyists. These were women running what amounted to small businesses, managing supply chains, maintaining quality, building customer relationships, handling the physical labour of production. And producing ale commercially, I should tell you, was not gentle work. It involved hauling 12-gallon vats of steaming liquid. It involved heating large quantities of water to the right temperature and maintaining that temperature with precision. We know from coroner's inquest records, again, those are the death investigation documents, that brewing accidents were a genuine occupational hazard. A woman named Agnes, whom we know from a record dated October 1370, slipped while carrying a large tub of scalding liquid in a brewhouse and fell into the vat. She did not survive. 5% of the women recorded in certain coroner's inquests are there because of brewing accidents. 5%. This was physically dangerous industrial work, and it was work that women did day in and day out without most of the legal protections or professional recognition that men in comparable trades enjoyed. Now here is where the story gets genuinely fascinating, and I want to pause and ask you something because I am curious what you think. When you imagine a successful medieval businesswoman, one who brewed ale commercially, who had regular customers, who made enough profit to contribute meaningfully to her family's income, or in some cases to support herself independently, what do you imagine her social reputation was like? Well, here is what the historical evidence actually shows. It is complicated in a way I find deeply revealing. In the early period of the trade, roughly the 12th through early 14th centuries, alewives were not particularly stigmatized. They were ordinary community figures. They were known to their neighbors. They put up a sign outside their door when their ale was ready for sale, typically a bundle of greenery or grain tied to a pole called an ale stake, which customers would recognize as they passed. Some alewives had loyal regulars. Some were well respected enough that when they died, their brewing equipment, the vats, the copper pots, the cauldrons, was carefully listed and bequeathed in their wills as valuable property. We know of one woman named Agnes who brewed commercially in medieval England and achieved a genuinely comfortable standard of living through her trade. When she died, her will itemized not only her brewing equipment, substantial vats of lead and brass mortar and pestle pans, but 80 pounds of white wool, several chests, household goods, coverlets, and considerable amounts of cash. She also left brewing utensils as bequests to her parish church, her parish priest, and 2 local monasteries. Agnes was not a poverty-stricken widow scraping by. She was a woman who had built something real. Then the 14th century arrived, and with it the Black Death, the plague that swept through England between 1347 and 1350, killed between a third and half the population. Its effects on society were profound and complex in ways we are still untangling today. But one of its effects, and this is relevant to our story, was to change the economics of brewing permanently. Before the plague, the ale trade had been small-scale, local and decentralized. After it, everything began to shift. The surviving population was smaller but paradoxically somewhat wealthier. On average, there was more land, more goods, more opportunity per surviving person. Living standards began to rise. Demand for ale increased. And as demand increased and as capital became more available to those who had survived and inherited the ale trade, began to look like something that could be scaled up, professionalized, industrialized. And that is when men decided they wanted it, not because women had been doing it badly, they'd been doing it well for centuries, but because the trade was now worth substantially more money than it had been before. As historian Judith Bennett put it with characteristic precision, the ale industry transformed from something dominated by occasional homebrewing women into a commercialized, professionalized, male-governed mainstream trade. And she was not simply describing a natural economic evolution. She was pointing at a pattern. Because here is what happened as the trade grew and became more lucrative, new barriers appeared. Guilds formed the professional associations of the brewing trade, and women could not join them. Capital requirements for the larger brewing operations went up, and women had structurally less access to capital and credit because of the very coverture laws we discussed in Part 2. Licensing systems emerged, and licenses were easier for men to obtain. The technology changed. Hop-flavoured beer arrived from the Netherlands in the late 1500s, and brewing hop beer at commercial scale required larger equipment and more investment. Men had easier access to that investment. Step by step, the industry transformed, and at each step, women found themselves on the outside. By 1500, the numbers had already shifted dramatically. In Oxford, where we have particularly good records because the university's presence meant meticulous documentation of the brewing industry that supplied its scholars, commercial breweries run by men had begun to appear and were quickly accounting for a substantial portion of the market. By 1600, the majority of professional brewers in London and many other English towns were male. Women who remained in the trade were mostly relegated to the lowest status roles, tipping and tapping in alehouses serving drinks that men's operations had produced. But the trade did not just take the work away from women. It also took something harder to quantify. It took their reputation. Because as men moved into brewing, they needed a narrative to justify their displacement of a female workforce that had been functioning perfectly well. And the narrative they reached for was by this point in history distressingly familiar: women could not be trusted. The church had long regarded alewives with suspicion. There were sermons from the medieval period warning that alewives cheated their customers using undersized measures, watering down the ale overcharging. There were even medieval depictions of the Last Judgment in which alewives were sent to hell for their dishonesty shown being carried to the devil in the very containers they had used to defraud their customers. Were some alewives dishonest? Almost certainly some were the same way some of anyone in any trade is dishonest. But the language used was not about individual bad actors. It was about all alewives. It was about women as a category being inherently untrustworthy. As Judith Bennett documents, the logic went something like this. The ale trade is full of trickery. Poor ale substituted for good measures that were just a bit too small. Inflated prices, customers who found they'd been cheated. For medieval people, it was easy to link these deceptions with women. Were not women as daughters of Eve naturally more deceptive and wicked than men? By such logic, any alewife, no matter how fair and competent, was already under suspicion simply by virtue of being a woman in a commercial role. And then came a poet named John Skelton. Skelton was a priest and a court poet in the early 16th century, an educated man who moved in elite circles, wrote for kings and nobles, and was read widely. Around 1517 he wrote a poem about a real woman, an actual alewife who lived near Leatherhead in Surrey, and who had been fined for selling ale at short measure. Her name was Alianora Roaming, and the poem Skelton wrote about her, a long, savage, satirical piece that he called The Tunning of Eleanor Rumming, was a character assassination that became one of the most widely read poems of the Tudor period. In Skelton's poem, Eleanor is depicted as grotesque, physically repulsive, morally degraded. Her ale contaminated her customers, chaotic and debauched. The poem says among its many pleasantries that chickens roost over her fermentation vat and contribute their droppings to the mixture. It describes her as having a kinship with the devil. It is coarse, mean-spirited and wildly exaggerated, but it was read and laughed at across England by people who had the cultural influence to shape public perception. And here is the detail that connects all of this to something you already know. Think about the image of a witch, the tall pointed black hat, the large cauldron bubbling on a fire, the broomstick leaning against the door, the cat watching from the corner. Now think about an alewife. The pointed hat was a fashion that alewives adopted because it made them visible above crowds in the marketplace, It was a kind of commercial signage, a way of being seen by potential customers from a distance. The cauldron was the brewing vessel, large and bubbling over the fire. The broomstick mounted outside the door was the traditional sign of an alehouse, a symbol that ale was available for sale inside. And the cat every brewing household kept cats. Cats guarded the grain stores from mice. Historians debate the direct line of causation between Alewives and witch imagery. Not all of them are convinced the connection is as direct as some popular accounts suggest. But what is indisputable is the timing. As Alewives were being pushed out of a trade they had dominated, as their reputation was being systematically dismantled through literature, through law, through cultural mockery, the iconography of the wicked woman with a pointed hat and a bubbling cauldron was spreading across England. Whether it was cause or coincidence or something in between, the result was the same. The woman who brewed was not a respectable businesswoman. She was a figure of suspicion, and by the time the witch trials of the 16th and 17th centuries reached their peak, the cultural groundwork had been laid over many generations. I think about this story a lot when I hear people say that history moves forward, that things simply get better over time naturally, inevitably like water flowing downhill. The alewives of medieval England are a useful corrective to that assumption, because here were women who had built something real. They had found a niche, an economically important, physically demanding, genuinely skilled trade, and they had dominated it for centuries. They had run it through wars and famines and plague. They had adapted, innovated, produced a product that every single person in England consumed every single day. And then the trade became too profitable, and they lost it. Not because of anything they had done wrong, but because the same structural forces that we discussed in Part 2, access to capital, access to legal protection, access to the formal institutions of economic life, made it easier for men to take over what women had built, and easier to justify that takeover by making the women who had built it look bad. There is a phrase that Judith Bennett uses in her work that I find genuinely haunting. She describes the history of women's work in the medieval and early modern periods as a dance in which women never lead. The steps change, the music changes, but the structure of who is directing and who is following that stays remarkably consistent. I do not think that observation is meant to be depressing exactly. I think it is meant to make us look clearly at something that is easy to overlook when you only study history in large sweeps. The details matter. The specific mechanisms matter. And understanding how a trade worth running gets taken from the people who built it, that is not just medieval history. That pattern has a very long afterlife. Now, we've been spending our time so far largely with peasant and working women, the women in the fields, in the cottage behind the brewing vat. But medieval England was a profoundly class-stratified society, and the lives of women at the very top of that structure looked on the surface radically different. Silk gowns instead of rough wool, castles instead of one-room cottages, servants instead of chickens. But were those women actually free? Did wealth and status give a noblewoman real power, or just a more elaborately decorated version of the same cage? In our next part, we're going to step inside the world of the noblewomen of medieval England. And the woman we're going to start with a 13th century heiress named Agnes Devesie, who refused to disappear quietly and ended up at the centre of a royal investigation, is going to tell us something surprising about what it actually meant to have power in medieval England when you happen to be a woman. There is an image that gets repeated endlessly whenever people try to visualize the life of a medieval noblewoman. A woman in a tall pointed headdress seated in a stone chamber, surrounded by ladies-in-waiting doing embroidery by a narrow window, while the world happens somewhere beyond the walls. Passive, decorative, waiting. I want to spend this part dismantling that image very thoroughly. not because it is entirely false, embroidery was indeed done, headdresses were indeed tall stone chambers were indeed cold, but because it captures perhaps 10% of the reality and leaves out the 90% that is actually interesting. The women at the top of medieval English society were not ornaments. They were in many cases the entire administrative backbone of the most powerful households in the country, and some of them, when circumstances pushed them far enough, revealed a capacity for independent action that the world around them had never quite anticipated. Let us start with Agnes Devesie. Agnes was born around 1220, the eldest daughter of a powerful English nobleman named William de Ferrers, Earl of Derby. Through her mother's family, the Great Martial Dynasty, she was connected to some of the most influential bloodlines in England and Ireland. She married a man named William de Vesie around 1244, and together they held extensive lands in Yorkshire, including the town of Malton and its surrounding estates. William died around 1253, leaving Agnes a widow while she was still in her early 30s. And here is where Agnes's story becomes interesting, because what she did with her widowhood was not to quietly retire to a smaller life. She managed her lands, she conducted legal business, she made enemies. We know this because of a document that survives in the National Archives in London dated September 1283. It is a commission of inquiry that is a formal royal investigation ordered by King Henry III, looking into what Agnes Devesie had done in Yorkshire. The document records a complaint from the prior and monks of Malton Priory, a religious house on Agnes's lands. The monks alleged that Agnes had set her servants and men on them, that they had seized the monks' horses, sheep, oxen and cows and refused to return them, that they had put animals in the monastery barns without food, that Agnes had made a public proclamation in her market at Malton forbidding anyone from selling food to the monks or even speaking to them. Effectively, Agnes Devesie had laid a private siege to a monastery. The monks were outraged. Agnes apparently was not particularly apologetic. Now I want to be clear, we do not have Agnes's side of this dispute. We do not know what grievance she had against Malton Priory. What we do know is that she had the resources, the networks, and the sheer confidence to take on a religious institution in her own market town and hold her ground long enough to warrant a royal investigation. She was not a woman who asked for permission before acting. She never remarried after William's death. She died in 1290, having controlled her own lands and money for nearly 40 years. We do not have any documents written by Agnes herself. She leaves no letters, no diary, no recorded words. But she leaves actions. And those actions tell us something important about what it meant to be a powerful woman in medieval England, even within all the constraints we've described. Agnes is a particularly vivid example, but she is not unique. And to understand why, we need to spend a moment with the broader situation of noblewomen in medieval England, the machinery of marriage, inheritance, and power that shaped their lives from the moment they were born. A noblewoman's value in the cold economic language of the medieval aristocracy was determined by two things: her bloodline and her property. Marriage was not a private matter of the heart. It was a negotiation between families conducted with the same seriousness that modern businesses bring to a merger, because the stakes were essentially the same. Land, income, political alliance, military obligation, the transfer of a daughter from one family to another, sealed agreements ended disputes and created networks of loyalty that could shape the politics of entire regions. The mechanics of this involved two specific types of property. The first was the dowry property that the bride's family gave to the groom at the time of the marriage. This could be land, money, goods, or some combination. Once transferred, it technically became the husband's. The second was the dower property that the groom's family designated for the bride to be hers if she was widowed. In England, by the 13th century, common law guaranteed a widow 1/3 of her husband's estate as dower. That 1/3 was hers alone, not her children's, not her husband's heirs, hers for the rest of her life. This meant that medieval widowhood and wealth were intertwined in a way that seems paradoxical until you sit with it for a moment. The most legally and economically autonomous women in medieval noble society were often women whose husbands had died. As a widow, a feme sole, to use the legal term we discussed in Part 2, a noblewoman could own property, sign contracts, run estates, conduct legal business, and appear in court in her own name. The death of a husband was in a very real sense the legal birth of a woman as an independent person, which explains why some noble women after experiencing widowhood were remarkably reluctant to give it up by remarrying. Ela of Salsbury is one of the most remarkable examples of this. Ela was born around 1191, the only child of William Fitzpatrick, 2nd Earl of Salisbury. When her father died, and she was still a young child, she became one of the most valuable heiresses in England, which made her simultaneously very important and very vulnerable. The control of a wealthy young heiress and her marriage was a tool of royal power. Ela was taken out of England to Normandy, whether for her safety or to control her, and her assets is debated by historians, and for a period she essentially disappeared from the official record. She was eventually found, brought back to England, and presented to King Richard I, who arranged her marriage to William Longaspay, his own illegitimate half-brother. It was a politically useful match for the crown. Ela's estates and the Salisbury title went to the king's family. Ela herself had very little say in any of it. She and William had 8 children. By many accounts, it was a reasonably good marriage. Though William's absences were frequent, he was an active soldier and courtier. In 1226 he died allegedly poisoned, though this was never proven. When archaeologists opened his tomb in 1791, they found a rat inside the skull. The rat apparently had been carrying traces of arsenic. Medieval mystery 500 years old. But here is what matters for our purposes. After William's death, Ela did not simply accept the life of a comfortable widow. She served as Sheriff of Wiltshire, a royal administrative position, one of the most significant local offices in the county, making her one of the extremely rare women to hold such a role in medieval England. She managed her estates with evident skill. She founded a nunnery at Lecoq in 1236, endowing it with considerable resources, and she eventually retired to Lecoq herself, becoming its prioress, then abbess. She died there in 1261. What strikes me most about Ela of Salsbury is the sheer trajectory of her life. Child heiress, politically arranged bride mother of 8, estate manager, royal sheriff, founder of a religious institution, abbess. Each phase shaped by external forces she had not chosen. And yet across all of it runs a thread of active decision-making, a woman who within the constraints she was given kept finding ways to matter. Now let me widen the frame a little, because I think there is a common misconception about noble women in medieval England that I want to address directly. The misconception goes like this: noble life was easier for women because they did not have to do physical labour. They had servants. They had comfortable houses. Therefore their position was fundamentally better than that of peasant women. And my honest response is, in terms of material comfort, often yes. In terms of autonomy, sometimes no. A peasant woman, as we discussed in Part 3, had very little formal power. But she also had relatively little formal visibility. Her life was not of interest to the machinery of royal politics. She was in a sense below the radar. A noble daughter, by contrast, was a piece in a very high-stakes game. Her body, her fertility, her bloodline, her emotional life, all of it was subject to scrutiny and management in ways that no peasant woman faced. The choice of her husband could be taken from her entirely. The timing of that marriage could be decided before she was old enough to understand what was happening. The land she brought to the marriage would pass immediately to the man she married, and until his death, or until she found some specific legal mechanism for carving out space for herself, she was subject to all the same strictures of coverture that applied to every married woman in England. What noble women had that peasant women largely did not was access to education, access to the church's mechanisms for some degree of independent action, access to legal counsel, and crucially access to enough resources that widowhood could mean genuine freedom rather than poverty. The symbol of all of this, the image that I find most evocative when I think about medieval noblewomen, is the ring of keys. Every lady of a medieval castle carried a ring of keys at her belt. It was not a decorative accessory. Those keys opened the storerooms, the armoury, the treasury, the food supplies. They were the physical embodiment of her authority over everything that sustained the household. When her husband was away at war on crusade attending the royal court, she was the one who held those keys. She collected the rents from the tenants. She presided over the manorial court, hearing disputes and dispensing justice. She dealt with merchants, managed the harvest, directed the staff, oversaw the defence of the estate. There is a remarkable historical record of noblewomen who, when their husbands were besieged or captured, or simply away too long, stepped into the full role of lordship without hesitation. Agnes, Countess of Dunbar, held Dunbar Castle for 19 weeks in 1338 against a siege led by William Montague, Earl of Salsbury. He eventually gave up and went home. Agnes did not. But I want to pause here and be honest about the limits of this power, because I think it is easy to swing from one oversimplification, the passive decorative noblewoman, to another, the powerful autonomous chatelaine who was in practice just as free as any man. The truth is murkier and more interesting. When a nobleman was home, his wife's authority was largely informal, the influence she exercised in conversation, in managing the household, in shaping the upbringing of children, and the alliances built through hospitality. She was not the legal head of the household. She was not the person whose name appeared in the official documents of estate management. Her practical contribution could be enormous. Her formal recognition of it was often minimal. When she was widowed, her formal authority could expand dramatically. But that authority was also contested by her husband's heirs, by the crown, if her lands were strategically important, by neighbours who saw a widow holding valuable property as an opportunity. Dower rights were guaranteed by law in theory. In practice, they were regularly contested, withheld, and fought over in court. Magna Carta itself, the great charter of English liberties signed in 1215, specifically included clauses protecting widows' rights to their dower, precisely because those rights were being violated so commonly that powerful women had pressured the barons to include them. Think about that for a moment. The rights of widows to receive what the law had already promised them were so routinely violated that it took a foundational document of English constitutional history to address the problem. Loretta de Braose is one of the women behind those clauses. She'd been recently widowed when King John forced her to relinquish her dower rights, an act of deliberate financial pressure that she and others like her had experienced firsthand. She was among the women whose specific grievances shaped the language of Magna Carta. Her name is almost never mentioned in popular accounts of that document. The barons get the credit. She and the others got, if they were lucky, the clause. What I keep returning to as I read about the lives of medieval noblewomen is this: they were simultaneously more powerful and more constrained than popular imagination tends to suggest. The contradictions are the point. A woman could run an estate of thousands of acres for years while her husband was away, make decisions that shape the lives of hundreds of tenants and servants, negotiate with merchants and conduct legal business, and still have that authority evaporate the moment her husband came home because none of it was formally hers. It existed in the gap that circumstances had created, not in the structure of the law. The structure of the law said she was covered, protected, subsumed. The Ring of Keys said something different. I think about the women who carried those keys, who knew every room in that household, every servant's name, every debt and credit in the estate accounts, who kept things running in the silence between one lord's departure and another's arrival, whose names appear briefly in the administrative records during the period of their husband's absence, then disappear again when he returns. They were not passive, they were the continuity, the institutional memory, the constant in an aristocratic world full of men who went away to fight and sometimes did not come back. And speaking of what happens when a woman is neither married nor a widow, when she occupies that strange contested middle space that medieval society both disapproved of and quietly depended on, that is exactly where we're going next. Because childbirth in medieval England was not just a medical event, it was a social ritual, a spiritual crisis, and for a staggering number of women the most dangerous room in the entire house. What happened inside that room, who was allowed in, who was not, what was believed, what was done, and what the church was quietly preparing on the other side of the door is a story that almost nobody tells completely. But we are going to tell it. Of all the rooms in a medieval English household, the great hall where people ate the sleeping chamber, where they huddled together for warmth, the kitchen with its permanent haze of smoke and grease, there was one room that was unlike all the others. One room that operated by completely different rules. One room where the normal hierarchies of medieval life were temporarily and extraordinarily suspended. It was the birthing room, and what happened inside it, and more importantly what was prepared just outside it, is a story that reaches into the deepest anxieties of the medieval world, about women, about bodies, about sin, about life, and about what comes after. Let us step inside. When a medieval woman's time drew near, something remarkable happened to the space around her. The room was prepared with deliberate, almost ceremonial care. Windows were covered not to create a romantic dimness, but because it was genuinely believed that too much light could damage the labouring woman's eyes. Tapestries were hung over the walls, the door was closed, and then all the men left. Not some of the men, all of them. Father, husband, brothers, male servants, male physicians out. There was a documented case from 15th century Belgium recorded by historian Louis Maes of a man named Henny van den Dam who hid behind a staircase to listen to his own wife in labour. The court fined him 15 livres. The language of the judgment was pointed. This was a thing that did not befit a man. Even eavesdropping was a punishable violation. Think about how strange that is in a world where women had almost no formally recognised authority. The birthing room was the one space, perhaps the only space in all of medieval English life where the rule was absolute: this belongs to women. Men do not enter. Inside the room, the woman in labour was attended by her midwife, and by a circle of female neighbours and relatives, 5, 6, sometimes more. These women were not spectators. They were active participants, holding the labouring woman, supporting her through contractions, offering encouragement, preparing the herbs and remedies the midwife required. Birth was a communal event in every sense of the word. The woman did not face it alone. The midwife herself was a figure of real authority and accumulated expertise. She learned her craft the way most medieval knowledge passed, not through formal instruction or written texts, but through years of direct experience taught by older midwives, refined through practice. She knew how to position a difficult baby. She knew which herbs could ease pain and which could speed contractions. She carried a birthing stool with her, a low seat shaped like a horseshoe open in the centre that allowed gravity to assist the process while keeping the woman's weight supported. She knew how to anoint her hands with oil from wild thyme and carefully attempt to reposition a child lying in the wrong direction. She knew, and this is a detail that I find both extraordinary and deeply moving, that she was authorized to perform the sacrament of baptism if the infant appeared unlikely to survive the birth. That last detail deserves a moment. The Catholic Church in medieval England held baptism as one of its most sacred and strictly regulated sacraments. The right to administer it was normally reserved for ordained priests, but infant deaths at or around the moment of birth were common enough, and the Church's belief that an unbaptized soul could not enter heaven was firm enough that an exception was carved out. A midwife, an unlicensed, usually illiterate woman who had learned her trade through generations of oral knowledge, could baptize a newborn child even before it was fully delivered if it seemed the child would die. If any limb was accessible, the water could be applied and the word spoken. That was not a small thing. In a world that jealously guarded the mechanisms of salvation, this was a genuine grant of spiritual authority to a woman who had no other formal standing in the religious hierarchy whatsoever. Let us talk honestly about the danger, because I think this is an area where the historical narrative has gone wrong in both directions. For a long time, popular history painted medieval childbirth as catastrophically lethal. The claim that 1 in 3 women died in childbirth circulated widely enough that many people accepted it as fact. Modern scholarship has complicated this considerably. A detailed study tracking the reproductive lives of over 100 aristocratic English women between 1236 and 1503 found that maternal mortality among elite women was around 1 to 2% per pregnancy, far higher than today certainly, but not the routine death sentence that older accounts implied. However, and this matters, aristocratic women were the best nourished, best supported and most fortunate group in medieval English society, for peasant women working physically demanding labour until almost the moment of delivery, often poorly fed, living in conditions where infection spread easily, the risks were higher. Archaeological evidence from medieval English cemeteries shows that female mortality peaked consistently between the ages of 25 and 35, exactly the prime childbearing years. Some Anglo-Saxon burial studies have estimated that up to half of young female deaths in certain communities may have been related to childbirth in some way. What this means in practice is not that every woman expected to die in labour, but that every woman knew someone who had. Birth was not exotic danger, it was familiar proximate woven into the texture of community life. A woman going into labour was going somewhere that her neighbours had gone before her, and some of them had not come back. And here is the piece of this story that I find most quietly devastating, and that almost never gets mentioned in the popular accounts. Before a noble or wealthy woman went into her lying-in chamber before the door closed, and the women gathered around her, there was often a visit to the church, a priest, a confession, and sometimes the administration of last rites, not because death was expected, but because it was possible. And in medieval Catholic theology, an unbaptized soul could not reach heaven, an unconfessed soul might be imperiled, and no responsible person left these matters to chance. A woman entering the birthing room in the 14th century might genuinely be doing the spiritual equivalent of what a soldier does before going into battle, making peace with God just in case she did not come out. I sit with that image sometimes, the quiet weight of it. A woman who by the standards of her world was doing exactly what she was supposed to do, fulfilling her fundamental social and religious duty as a wife, and the first step in that process was to prepare for her own death. If she survived, and most did, there was still more ceremony ahead. After the birth, the woman remained in confinement in her lying-in chamber, surrounded by her female attendants for a period of roughly a month. This was partly practical. Rest and recovery were genuinely needed, and the risk of infection from the birth itself meant that limiting her exposure to the outside world had real health benefits, even if nobody understood why in the terms we would use today. but it was also deeply rooted in religious ideas about purity. The body that had given birth was considered by medieval theological thinking to be in a state of ritual impurity, not sinful but not clean in the specific spiritual sense the Church used that word. A woman who had just given birth could not attend Mass, could not take communion, could not fully re-enter the social world, until she was churched. The churching ceremony was a church service performed roughly a month after the birth in which the new mother was formally welcomed back into the congregation. She came to the church door, often veiled, often carrying a candle. The priest met her, said specific prayers, and admitted her into the church. It was in the language of the time, a purification, the word used in the book of Leviticus, for the ritual cleansing required after childbirth. Now here is the complexity. Because churching was not experienced the same way by all women. For some, the historical evidence suggests it felt like a stigma, a confirmation that the body which had just performed one of the most fundamental acts of human life was somehow tainted by it. For others, it seems to have been something quite different, a celebration, a communal welcome back, a moment when the community formally acknowledged what the woman had survived and done. In some areas, churching was followed by a gathering of female neighbours' food-drink, and the kind of festivity that marked any significant transition in a woman's life. The truth is probably that it was both things simultaneously felt differently by different women in different circumstances, and that both the complexity and the ambiguity are worth holding. What I find most striking about the birthing room as a space in medieval England is the profound contradiction at its centre. Here is a room where women had total authority, where the midwife's judgment was law, where no man entered, where the accumulated knowledge of generations of female practice was the only expertise available. Here is a room where women supported each other through one of the most physically demanding experiences a human body can undergo, and where that support was not incidental but essential. The presence of experienced women around a labouring woman was not comfort, it was medicine. And yet this room was separated from the rest of the world, not because women's authority was being celebrated, but because childbirth was considered a matter too associated with the female body, with blood, with the consequences of sexuality for men to witness. The exclusion that gave women authority in the birthing room was rooted in the same set of ideas about female impurity that required churching afterward. The power was real. The reason for the power was not flattering. I think about that paradox often. Medieval women navigating a world that simultaneously needed them and regarded them with a kind of uneasy theological suspicion. That gave them authority in the birthing room while also requiring them to be purified when it was over. That depended on their labour, their expertise, their bodies, and rarely said so in the official record. The midwife who spent 40 years delivering babies in her village, who turned hundreds of infants in the dark by feel alone, who knew which prayers to say and which herbs to burn and how to judge in the silence of a room full of frightened women whether this was a labour that would end in life or in grief. She was not licensed. She was not paid well. She left almost no written trace of her existence. But every single person in that village owed their life at one remove to a woman like her. There is one more thread I want to pull before we leave this room. The text that described medieval childbirth, the advice on how to manage difficult labour, which herbs to use, what positions helped, were written overwhelmingly by men. Monks and clergymen who had taken vows of celibacy, men who could not enter the birthing room, who had no first-hand experience of pregnancy or labour, who in some cases genuinely believed that the female reproductive organs were simply inverted versions of male anatomy, turned inside out and therefore inferior. These men wrote the books. The women who actually knew what they were doing passed their knowledge by word of mouth, woman to woman, hand to hand, generation to generation. Most of that knowledge is gone. We can reconstruct fragments of it from the court records of midwives fined for practicing without licenses, from the occasional reference in a coroner's inquest from the artifacts found in birthing chambers, the birthing stools, the herbal pouches, the prayer rolls wrapped around labouring women's bellies in the hope of protection. But the knowledge itself, the hard-won specific practical understanding of how to bring a human being safely into the world, lives mostly in the silence between documents, where all the most important things these women knew seem to have ended up. And that silence brings us to a question that has been threading through this entire series, one we've been approaching from different angles with each part, because we've talked about the girl who had no choices, the woman who disappeared legally on her wedding day, the peasant worker whose labour built an economy, the alewife who was pushed out of the trade she created, the noblewoman who ran estates and signed documents, and then vanished from the record when her husband came home, the woman who entered the birthing room, sometimes as if going to war. What about the woman who simply refused to be any of those things? The one who stayed unmarried or was widowed, and found herself in that strange space outside the normal categories. Because in medieval England she occupied a surprisingly complex position, sometimes more vulnerable than anyone, and sometimes in ways that would have shocked the people who designed the system more free. Somewhere in the middle of the 14th century, a woman named Agnes Devesie was sitting in a room trying to figure out how to survive. Her husband, Thomas Earl of Lancaster, had been executed for treason in 1322, his lands and title forfeited to the crown. Alice herself was now technically one of the most legally free women in England. As a widow, she was a person under the law. She could own property, conduct business, sign documents, go to court in her own name. Everything that marriage had taken from her had just been handed back, and she was in more danger than she had ever been in her life. Because in medieval England, a wealthy widow was not simply a free woman, she was a prize. And some men looking at Alice, at her remaining estates, her noble lineage, her legal right to make decisions about her own future, saw only one thing, a route to everything she had. Agnes Devesie was abducted, not once, but more than once. Her abductor on the final occasion, a knight named Hugh de Frene, eventually married her. Whether Alice had any real choice in that outcome, the historical record, as it so often does, leaves tantalizingly unclear. Her story is not unusual. It is in fact almost routine, and it tells us something essential about the strange contradictory position of the unmarried woman in medieval England, the spinster, the widow, the woman who existed outside the structure of a husband's household. She was more legally free than any married woman, and she was in certain ways more exposed to harm than almost anyone else. Let us take a step back and think about what medieval English society actually believed about women who were not attached to men. The operating assumption was stated plainly by legal commentators. Of the time, all women were either married or to be married. That was the category. That was the expectation. An unmarried woman who had never been married was a maiden, a temporary state, something to be resolved by a wedding. A widow was theoretically also in a temporary state, expected to either remarry or enter a religious life. The permanent, independent single woman was in the framework of medieval social thought, almost a contradiction in terms. She was an anomaly, and anomalies made people uncomfortable. The word spinster itself tells part of this story. As we touched on briefly earlier in this series, it derived from the occupation of spinning so ubiquitous among unmarried women that the word for the worker became the word for the marital status. A woman not yet married was above all a woman who was spinning, waiting in the social imagination for life to begin properly. But here is the number that surprises most people. By the late medieval and early modern period, somewhere around 25% of European adults never married at all. Not nuns, not women who entered religious life formally, just people who, for reasons of economic circumstance, personal choice, or sheer poverty never found or formed a permanent household with a spouse. Among women specifically, the single life permanent not temporary was far more common than the popular image of medieval marriage for everyone suggests. Those women existed in the gaps of the social system. They were not invisible. They show up in court records, in tax lists, in wills, in the accounts of parish poor relief. They were real and numerous and living actual textured lives. But the social framework around them had not really made space for them to exist comfortably. There was no honoured category for the permanent single woman. There was no cultural script that said, here is a life you can live with dignity without a husband in the world. So they improvised. Before we go further, I want to be honest about something because I think it matters for understanding this period clearly. The experience of unmarried women in medieval England was not uniform. It was shaped by the same variable that shaped almost everything else in this world, whether you were rich or poor. A wealthy widow like Alice de Lacy or like Agnes Devesie, whom we discussed in Part 5, had real options. She could manage estates. She could conduct legal business. She could in practice live independently for decades, controlling her own resources, choosing her own household, maintaining networks of loyal tenants and servants. The legal freedom of widowhood for a woman with assets translated into actual life choices. A poor widow or a poor unmarried woman was in a profoundly different situation. Without land, without substantial savings, without family support, the legal category of femme sole, the woman alone, offered rights that could not be exercised because the material resources to exercise them simply were not there. You could in theory own property if you were single, but if you had no property to own, what did that freedom mean? Poor unmarried women in medieval England were among the most economically marginal people in a society that had very few cushions for anyone at the bottom. They worked as day labourers. They took in washing. They sold small goods in the marketplace. They lived 2 or 3 together in a rented room because sharing costs was the only way to survive. And when they were old or sick or their income dried up for any reason, they often found themselves dependent on parish charity, which was unreliable, morally weighted, and required performing a very specific kind of humble, grateful, pious femininity to access at all. The vulnerability of single women in medieval England operated on multiple levels simultaneously. And I want to talk about one that historians have been grappling with seriously, the connection between being an unmarried woman and being suspected of witchcraft. I want to be careful here because the peak of formal witch trials in England came considerably later than the medieval period we've been discussing. The major witch trials in England were a largely 16th and 17th century phenomenon. But the cultural associations that made single women, and particularly elderly poor widows, vulnerable to those accusations were built up over centuries. The medieval period laid the groundwork. An elderly woman living alone without a husband or children to vouch for her respectability, without formal standing in the institutions of the village, scraping by on the margins of the community economy, she was in the eyes of her neighbours an anomaly, outside the normal structures, dependent on relationships that were transactional and sometimes resentful. If she had any knowledge of herbal remedies, the kind of practical knowledge almost every woman in this period accumulated, that knowledge could be understood as useful when things went well, and sinister when things went wrong. A cow got sick. Someone's baby died. The harvest failed. Who do you look at? The person who's already outside the normal categories. The woman without a husband. The woman who nobody quite vouched for. The woman who had knowledge that was hard to explain, and relationships with the community that were complicated by dependency and sometimes by bitterness. The historian who has traced this pattern most carefully is probably Barbara Hannawalt, who noted the way that medieval communities' anxieties about women who occupied the margins, who were not firmly attached to a household, not firmly under someone's authority, crystallized around figures who were already visible targets for communal suspicion. But, And this is important. Not all of this was oppression without complexity, because there were also single and widowed women in medieval England who found ways to use their anomalous status not as a disadvantage but as a kind of power. The widow who ran her own shop, the never-married woman who had worked long enough in a trade to have developed real expertise and a customer base, the woman who had outlived 2 or 3 husbands and accumulated enough dower rights from each that she was at 50 genuinely comfortable and genuinely answerable to nobody. These women exist in the historical record too, quietly. In wills in court cases, in the accounts of guild records where a widow continued her deceased husband's trade under her own authority, and sometimes they left explicit evidence of how they felt about their situation. In the wills that survive from medieval and early modern England documents that widows and unmarried women could finally write, because they were no longer covered by a husband's legal existence, you sometimes hear something that sounds almost like relief. A woman leaving her property to her daughters, her female friends, her sisters, her community of women, distributing what she had built to the people who had mattered to her in the order that she chose without anyone's permission. By one estimate, around 80% of female wills from the later medieval and early modern period were written by widows. Married women could not make wills without their husband's consent. Widows could, and the contents of those wills tell their own story about who these women had actually been, what they had valued, who they had loved, what kind of legacy they wanted to leave. Let me tell you about a specific pattern that historians have found particularly revealing. It concerns not the exceptional wealthy widow, but ordinary women, peasant and middling-class widows, and the question of whether they chose to remarry. The evidence from medieval manorial records is fascinating and somewhat counterintuitive. Many widows, when they had sufficient resources to support themselves, chose not to remarry, even when they faced social pressure to do so, even when the lord of the manor sometimes applied direct economic pressure, charging higher rents, or fees to a widow who held land without a male head of household. They refused, or at least delayed or found ways to navigate the pressure. Some of them entered into informal arrangements, a son or servant acting formally as the male head of household, while the widow actually ran everything. Some of them found community within networks of other women in similar situations. Single women in medieval towns often did live together, sharing resources, creating a kind of household that was not built around a husband but around mutual need, and often the evidence suggests mutual affection. The medieval English word gossip, which originally meant godmother, or more broadly a close female friend, tells its own story. It described the network of relationships between women, the web of loyalty and information, and practical support that ran alongside the formal, male-dominated world of the village and the town. When medieval anxieties about groups of women gathering together appear in sermons and satirical literature, the fear that women were gossiping, plotting, exchanging dangerous knowledge, what they were responding to was something real. Women were gathering, they were talking, they were maintaining relationships and networks that operated independently of male oversight. And that made some people very nervous indeed. I want to end this part with Agnes Devesie because the story has a piece that most accounts leave out. After her abduction and third marriage to Hugh de Frene, a marriage that was in all probability not one she had freely chosen, Alice did not simply disappear into the role of wife again. She continued to manage her property. She continued to appear in legal records in her own name, conducting her own affairs. When Hugh died, she did not remarry. She spent her final years in what appears to have been a deliberate and sustained choice to remain single, controlling her own estates, living on her own terms. She died in 1348. The historical record does not tell us what she thought about her life. It does not preserve her voice, but the shape of what she did, the choices she made within the very tight constraints she was given, suggests a woman who understood exactly what she had and exactly what it was worth to protect it. There is a 17th century legal phrase I keep thinking about in relation to women like Alice. It goes, "A woman at her own commandment." That was how English law described the widow, not free in every sense, not equal, but commandment, her own, for a world that had spent so much energy making sure women were under someone's command. That phrase is almost revolutionary. It is the most freedom the medieval English legal system had in it to give a woman. And some women, not many, but some, grabbed it with both hands and did not let go. Now here is a curious thing about medieval England. The same society that made single women legally free while simultaneously making them targets for suspicion and coercion, that same society had one officially sanctioned, church-approved, even celebrated path for a woman who did not want to be a wife. A path that offered something that ordinary life simply could not: education. A community of other women, literacy, authority, the possibility of genuine intellectual work. I'm talking about the convent. And what women found inside those walls, and how some of them used what they found there to say things that the rest of the world was not ready to hear, is the story waiting just ahead. What does it feel like to be in a room where the usual rules do not apply? I've been thinking about that question since we started this series. We have talked at length about the rules, the legal rules, the economic rules, the social rules that shaped the lives of women in medieval England, in ways that were sometimes suffocating and often invisible. And we have seen how women navigated those rules, found the gaps in them, pushed against them quietly. But there is one space we've not yet stepped inside, one place where the rules bent in a genuinely different direction. The convent, and specifically the intellectual life that some women found there. Because here is the thing about medieval convents that most people raised on popular culture's image of nuns, silently shuffling between chapel and kitchen, genuinely do not know for a certain kind of woman, at a certain period in medieval history entering a religious community, was not a retreat from intellectual life, it was the beginning of one. Let us start with what the convent actually offered that the world outside did not: literacy. In a society where, by some estimates, fewer than 1% of women could read and write, nuns were routinely taught both. Reading was essential for participating in the liturgical life of the religious community. You had to be able to follow the prayers, the scripture, the daily office. Some communities taught Latin alongside English or French. Some educated their nuns in music, history, theology, and natural science. A woman who entered a convent poor and unlettered might emerge years later as one of the most educated people in her region, male or female. Authority. In the outside world, as we've discussed at length, women's formal authority was severely constrained. In a religious community, an abbess held genuine power. She ran the institution. She managed its finances, its lands, its staff. She adjudicated disputes among her nuns. She was accountable to the church hierarchy above her, yes, but within her own walls her word was law. It was one of the very few formal leadership roles the medieval world made available to women: community. A convent was in its essence a household built entirely around women, governed by women, sustained by women. In a world that organized almost every female life around a male household, fathers, husbands, or sons, this was extraordinary. The historian Eileen Power, one of the great pioneers of medieval women's history, wrote that the nunnery served as, in her words, a refuge of female intellectuals, not a prison, a refuge. Now I want to be honest about the complications because there were real ones. Not all women who entered convents did so by choice. Younger daughters from noble families were sometimes sent to convents because there was not enough dowry to marry them all respectably, or because the family had too many mouths to feed. Girls could be given to a convent in childhood, long before they were old enough to meaningfully consent to the religious life. The Church officially required that women entering religious life do so willingly, but the gap between official requirement and practical reality, as we have seen throughout this series, was often enormous. And not all convents were places of intellectual flourishing. Many smaller English nunneries were genuinely poor institutions, often struggling to provide adequate food and clothing for their members, let alone books and tutors. The visitation records of English bishops, the regular inspections conducted to ensure convents were functioning properly, often read as a catalogue of problems: leaking roofs, unpaid debts, nuns who had not received a proper education, communities in which nobody could read or write with any fluency. But here is the thing: even in those more modest, more constrained environments, the community of women mattered. Even without the library and the learned abbess, the convent was a space where women governed themselves, where female relationships were not incidental but foundational, where the entire rhythm of life, work, prayer, meals, rest was organized by women for women in ways that nowhere else in medieval England replicated. Let me tell you about Hildigard of Bingan. She is not English, she is German, but her story illuminates something so important about what the religious life made possible for extraordinary women that I could not leave her out. Hildigard was born around 1098, the 10th child of a minor German noble family. In medieval custom, when you were the 10th child, the so-called tithe of children you might be given to the church. She was placed with a religious noblewoman named Jutta of Sponheim at around the age of 7 or 8, and by her mid-teens she had taken her vows as a nun. For the next several decades, Hildigard lived in the monastery, studying, praying, and beginning to experience the extraordinary visions that would define her life. She described seeing light, what she called the living light, filling her consciousness and bringing her revelations of divine truth. She began writing at around the age of 42. Over the next 40 years, she produced an output that is simply staggering: 3 volumes of visionary theology, 2 major works on medicine and natural science, including observations about the human body and its ailments that were more careful and empirically grounded than most of what her male contemporaries were producing. 77 original musical compositions, a body of work that remains some of the most beautiful music written in the entire medieval period, and that is still performed today. Nearly 400 surviving letters written to popes, emperors, abbots, kings, a morality play, an invented language complete with its own alphabet, which she apparently created for the pleasure of it. She conducted 4 preaching tours through Germany in the 1160s and 70s, a practice that was technically not supposed to be available to women who were expected not to teach or speak in public on spiritual matters. She did it anyway, standing in church buildings and public spaces denouncing clerical corruption and calling for reform, speaking to clergy and ordinary people alike. Emperor Frederick Barbarossa sought her advice on matters of church and state. Pope Eugenius III gave his personal approval to her writings and encouraged her to continue. Bernard of Clairvaux, arguably the most influential churchman in Europe at the time, treated her as an intellectual equal. She lived to 81. She died in 1179, having accomplished within the framework of a religious life more than almost any person of her era, regardless of gender. She was declared a Doctor of the Church by Pope Benedict XVI in 2012, only the 35th person ever to receive that honour, and only the 4th woman. Now Hildigard is extraordinary even by the standards of remarkable people. I want to be careful not to present her as if her experience was typical of convent life. It was not. She was an exceptional individual operating at exceptional heights. But she is not a complete anomaly either. She operated within a framework that made her possible. The convent gave her education when she was a child. The convent gave her a community of women, including her beloved Richardis, who assisted in writing and organising her work for years, until to Hildigard's great grief she was moved to another institution. The convent gave her the institutional authority to write, to speak, to act in ways that no woman outside its walls could have done so openly. Hildigard used every bit of what the religious life had to give her, and then pushed against its limits anyway. That combination, using the structure and then transcending it, feels like a very medieval female thing to do. Now let's come closer to home, to England, to a small room attached to a church in the city of Norwich, and to a woman we know almost nothing about, whose actual name we do not even know, who wrote the most astonishing thing. Her name, or rather the name she took from the church she was attached to, was Julian of Norwich. She was born around 1342, and she spent the later decades of her life as an anchoress, a woman who had formerly enclosed herself in a small cell attached to St. Julian's Church in Norwich, dedicated entirely to prayer and contemplation, never leaving the cell until she died. The anchorite life was the most extreme form of religious enclosure, not a convent with its community, its rhythms of communal work and prayer, but a single room, a wall between the anchoress and the outside world, with windows that allowed food to be passed in and people to speak through for spiritual counsel. A ceremony of entrance to the anchor hold that deliberately echoed the rituals of burial, because you were in a very real theological sense dying to the world. Julian had been seriously ill at the age of 30 in 1373. She believed she was dying. She was given last rites. And as she lay in what she thought were her final hours, she received 16 visions which she called her shewings of Christ's suffering. When she recovered, she wrote them down. What she wrote is by every serious reckoning one of the most extraordinary pieces of theological writing in the English language. It was the first book ever written in English by a woman whose name we know. The first. But it is not just historically significant because it was written by a woman. It is significant because of what it actually says. In a time when the dominant theological message about human suffering, particularly women's suffering, was that pain was punishment for sin, that women in particular bore the burden of Eve's transgression, that endurance and submission were the appropriate responses, Julian looked at her visions and concluded something entirely different. She concluded that God was not wrathful, that sin and suffering, while real, were not the final truth about existence. And she wrote one of the most quoted sentences in English religious literature: all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. She went further. She described God specifically, Jesus using the language of motherhood, not just like a mother, but as a mother in nature and in essence, in a tradition that had been exclusively using masculine language for the divine for over 1,000 years. Julian of Norwich sat in her small cell and rewrote the terms. Here is what I find most moving about Julian. She was writing in the middle of one of the most catastrophically difficult periods in English history. Norwich, her city, had been devastated by the Black Death of 1348, which killed roughly a third to a half of the population. She had lived through the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. She'd witnessed poverty, grief, illness, early death, the entire fabric of suffering that medieval English life was made of. And she sat in her cell and wrote that all shall be well, not as denial, not as spiritual bypass, but as a deeply considered theological conclusion arrived at through years of careful thought. Do you ever wonder what it would have felt like to visit her window? People did. Right through her old age, people came to the anchor hold at St. Julian's Church in Norwich to speak with her through the window, to receive counsel, to be heard. In around 1414, when Julian was probably in her 70s, a woman named Marjorie Kemp herself, a remarkable figure, author of what may be the first autobiography written in English, travelled to Norwich specifically to ask Julian for spiritual guidance. Marjorie had had visions of her own and was uncertain what to make of them. She went to Julian. Julian told her anytime you experience true feelings of love, peace, and the desire to serve God, you can trust that these come from the Holy Spirit. She did not dismiss her. She did not say, "You are a woman, this is not for you." She gave counsel with the authority of someone who had spent decades looking at these questions very carefully. The convent, then, the anchor hold, the religious life. What made these places matter in the history of medieval women is not that they were perfect. They were not. They carried their own constraints, their own hierarchies, their own mechanisms of control. An abbess was powerful within her walls, but she remained accountable to male church authority above her. An anchoress like Julian had extraordinary freedom of thought, but she'd given up the physical freedom of movement for it. The bargain was real, but within those constraints something happened. Women read, women wrote, women governed communities and made decisions and developed expertise that the outside world would never have allowed them. Women like Julian of Norwich sat in small rooms and thought long, careful thoughts, and what they concluded shaped the spiritual imagination of England for centuries. The word anchoress comes from the Greek word for withdrawal, but what Julian withdrew from the noise and the danger and the endless demands of a life organized around everyone else's needs allowed her to become more present to what was actually true, more herself. That is, I think, one of the most persistent paradoxes of the lives of medieval women. The spaces that looked like restriction were sometimes the ones that made the deepest freedom possible. And now, in the final arc of this series, we are turning toward the things these women experienced that most often go unexamined. Not their legal status, not their labour, not even their spiritual lives, but the texture of the world they actually lived in. What they ate, what they wore, what the small rhythms of a medieval woman's day actually felt like when nobody was writing it down. Because there is a version of history that only looks at the grand events and the famous names, and then there is the version that asks what was it actually like? What were the small honest human pleasures of being alive in medieval England as a woman? What made people laugh? What made them glad? That is where we are going next. All right, let me ask you something. Honestly, we have spent 8 parts now looking at the harder aspects of medieval women's lives, the laws that erased them, the work that exhausted them, the dangers that surrounded them, the structures that confined them, and all of it has been true. All of it has mattered. But here is what I keep coming back to. These were not women defined entirely by their difficulties. They were people. And people, regardless of what century they inhabit, are not merely their circumstances. They eat something that surprises them with its sweetness. They laugh at something ridiculous. They care about how they look. They have opinions about things. They argue. They gossip in the original sense of that lovely word which meant their close female friends. They find small moments that are genuinely theirs. So this part we are pulling the lens back from the grand structures and sitting down quietly with what the everyday texture of life actually felt like. What these women ate, what they wore, what made them laugh, what small beauty existed inside a world that was often difficult. Because I think you deserve to see them whole, not just as objects of historical analysis, but as people who were present in their lives in ways that still feel human and recognizable across 7 centuries. Let us start with food. Because food is where life is always most honest. The basic daily diet of a medieval English peasant woman was by modern standards remarkably simple, and also in certain ways more nutritionally varied than you might expect. Pottage was the foundation, that thick steaming everything in the pot stew that we have already mentioned briefly, but I want to sit with it a little longer, because pottage was not just one thing. It was an endlessly flexible format. Oats, barley, dried peas, whatever vegetables the kitchen garden had produced, cabbage, onions, leeks, parsnips, garlic. In good times, a scrap of salted pork or a handful of dried fish. In lean times, just grain and water and whatever greens were available. Every family's pottage was different. It changed with the season, with the harvest, with what was available to forage. A woman who knew her hedgerows, who knew where the best brambles grew, and where to find hazelnuts in autumn, and which mushrooms were safe and which were not, was adding genuine variety and nutrition to her family's diet in ways that the official record almost never captures. She knew things about her local landscape that were not written anywhere. They were in her accumulated over a lifetime, and pottage, by the way, actually tasted good. There is a persistent modern assumption that peasant food was bland and joyless, but a well-made pottage with fresh herbs cooked slowly over an open fire in a properly seasoned pot with good bread to mop it up. I suspect that on a cold evening after a long day it was deeply satisfying. The first medieval cookbook written in English, the form of Curie, produced around 1390 by the royal cooks of King Richard II, gives us a sense of how much attention medieval people paid to flavour spicing and the art of combining ingredients. That sophistication existed at every level of the social scale, adapted to whatever ingredients were available. Bread was equally central and equally stratified. White bread made from fine milled wheat was the food of the wealthy and the aspiration of the poor. A peasant family typically ate darker, denser bread from rye or barley, perhaps mixed with dried peas or oats to make it go further. It was heavy, it was sometimes coarse, but it was filling and it was calorie-dense, which was what mattered. Here is a detail that I find quietly revealing about how the medieval social hierarchy operated. Peasants were not in many areas allowed to bake their bread at home. They were required to bring their grain to the Lord's communal oven and pay for the use of it. The Lord controlled even this, the warmth of your own hearth, the smell of your own bread. Every loaf reminded you of your place, but let us talk about the food that was genuinely pleasurable. Because medieval England was not a world without sweetness, not even for ordinary people. Honey was everywhere. Before cane sugar became more widely available in the later medieval period, honey was the primary sweetener used in cooking and preserving fruit in drinks. Many peasant households kept bees, and honey from those hives was a genuine small luxury, a sweetness that cost nothing but the labour of maintaining the hive. Strawberries. In early summer, wild strawberries grew at the edges of fields and forests, and picking them required nothing but time and knowing where to look. They were small, intensely flavoured, nothing like the large, pale fruits we have now. Medieval people ate them fresh with cream if they had it, or simply as they were. There are illuminated manuscripts from the 14th and 15th centuries that show children and women picking strawberries in fields, their faces registering what is unmistakably delight. That expression, a child's face at the discovery of ripe fruit, has not changed in 7 centuries. Seasonal eating in medieval England meant that the arrival of certain foods was a genuine event. The first cherries of summer, the first green peas from the garden, apples, in autumn their sweetness concentrated by the cold nights. These were not just nutrition, they were small seasonal celebrations. The medieval year was marked by them as surely as it was marked by the church calendar. Now let's talk about clothes. And here is where things get genuinely interesting, because the story of medieval women's clothing is not just about what they wore, it is about what wearing certain things meant, and about what happened when people wore things they were not supposed to. The fundamental garment for women across all social classes was the tunic or gown, long-sleeved, close-fitting above the waist and flowing below it. Over this, wealthier women wore a surcoat and outer layer that came in and out of fashion through the medieval period. Underneath everything was a linen chemise or smock, the layer closest to the skin, which was washed more regularly than the outer garments, precisely because it served as a barrier between the body and the more expensive, harder to launder outer clothing. Wool was the fabric of everyday life. England's wool was famous across Europe. It was one of the country's most valuable exports, the foundation of the medieval English economy. The ordinary English woman wore it, slept under it, spun it, wove it. Linen made from flax that was grown retted, beaten and spun through a labour-intensive process that was also women's work, was the fabric of undergarments and household linens. And then there was colour. This is where it gets socially interesting. Colour in medieval clothing was not decorative, it was information. It told you at a glance where a person stood in the social hierarchy. Not because colour was inherently linked to class, but because producing rich, saturated, durable colour required expensive dyes. Scarlet and crimson produced from a tiny insect called kermes that had to be imported from the Mediterranean at great cost were the colours of wealth and power. Rich blues from woad and later from indigo. Deep saturated greens. These were not colours available to ordinary people. They would fade on cheaper cloth or they were simply unaffordable. A peasant woman wore earth colours. Russet a warm brownish red, the cheapest dye available. Undyed wool in its natural greys, creams and browns. Pale yellows from local plants. These were not ugly colours, but they were clearly different from the vivid dyes of the wealthy, and everyone knew what that difference meant. The English sumptuary laws, which were passed repeatedly from the 1330s onward, made this hierarchy formal. The laws specified in considerable detail what fabrics, colours and trimmings each social class was permitted to wear. Wives of yeomen and craftsmen could not wear silk veils or kerchiefs. Only those of knightly rank and above could wear certain furs. Only the very highest could wear cloth of gold or purple silk. The laws were by many accounts somewhat routinely ignored, particularly by the rising merchant class who had the money to dress better, but not the official status, which is presumably why Parliament had to keep passing them over and over again. But their existence tells you something important. People cared deeply about this. They dressed with intention. They used clothing to signal aspiration, status, identity. And here is the detail I love most about medieval fashion. Women got creative about circumventing the rules. Slash sleeves deliberately cut so that an expensive contrasting fabric underneath could be glimpsed through the gaps became fashionable. The sumptuary laws banned slash sleeves. Then they became fashionable again with the costly fabric replaced by a slightly less costly one that still gave the impression of luxury. Elaborately embroidered buttonholes appeared to replace expensive metal buttons that had been banned. Garments were lined on the inside with forbidden fabrics that were never quite visible enough to prove a violation. There is something wonderful about this. A woman who could not legally wear the colour or fabric she wanted finding a way to have a version of it anyway. Not as grand political resistance, just as the very human desire to look the way you want to look. To feel for a moment like someone who has choices. What about the moments of joy, the festivities, the times when the grind of daily life paused? Medieval England had far more holidays than the modern world tends to imagine. The church calendar was dense with feast days, saints' days, major religious festivals, local celebrations, and on many of these days work stopped. The records suggest that in some periods there may have been 40 or 50 such holidays per year, many of them occasions for communal celebration at the village level. The May Day celebrations were among the most beloved. Villages would rise early, go into the woods to gather hawthorn and greenery, decorate their homes, dance around a maypole, hold games and contests. Women participated fully. They wore flowers in their hair. They danced. The church periodically worried about the pagan undercurrents of May Day festivities and tried to regulate them with limited success. Harvest festivals at the end of summer were another communal moment. The last sheaf of grain cut from the field, the harvest queen or the corn dolly was often ceremonially carried home by a woman decorated with flowers and ribbons. After the harvest came in, there was a feast ale that had been saved for the occasion's songs, a brief exhalation after the most intense labour of the year. The winter feast of Christmas was weeks long, punctuated by specific celebrations on different days, each with its own character. Twelfth night at the very end of the Christmas season was an occasion for particular festivity, for disguise and comedy, and the temporary inversion of a normal social hierarchy as the lowest made mock king for a day elaborate games played that allowed a certain amount of irreverence. And through all of this music, medieval England was saturated in music in ways that we who can produce music at will from any device in our pockets sometimes fail to appreciate. Songs were the original portable entertainment. You carried them in your memory. Women sang while they worked. We know this from records, from complaints, from the occasional dismissive account by a clergyman who found female singing distracting. They sang while spinning, while grinding grain, while doing laundry at the river. The songs they sang were not preserved mostly. They were oral, passed from mother to daughter, neighbour to neighbour. But the singing was real. I want to talk about one more thing in this part humour. Because medieval people were funny, genuinely sometimes brilliantly funny. And the idea that the Middle Ages were grim and humourless is one of the more persistent and more wrong myths that popular culture has maintained about this period. Medieval humour was often ribald jokes about the body, about sex, about bodily functions, delivered with a frankness that the more polite centuries that came after tended to sanitize away. Geoffrey Chaucer, writing in the late 14th century, is full of this kind of comedy. His Miller's Tale, His Wife of Bath. These are not the works of a culture that took itself too seriously, and women specifically appear in the historical record as people who are funny, who appreciated humour, who could give as good as they got in verbal sparring. The figure of the sharp-tongued woman, the woman who had something to say and said it was a stock character in medieval literature, usually presented negatively but sometimes with a kind of reluctant admiration. The wife of Bath, Chaucer's famous creation, who has outlived 5 husbands and has deeply considered opinions about everything, was supposed to be a caricature. But Chaucer clearly enjoyed writing her too much for her to feel like only that. Medieval women told jokes, they gossiped, they shared information, observation stories, the kind of community intelligence that kept villages functioning. They laughed at the ridiculous aspects of the world around them. There is a medieval riddle tradition. Riddles were a popular form of entertainment at all social levels, and some of the surviving riddles are genuinely funny. Clever double meaning designed to produce a moment of surprised laughter when the innocent answer to an apparently rude question turned out to be something completely mundane. These riddles were told by everyone, including women, including almost certainly women who'd been working since 3 a.m. and had a dozen things yet to do before dark. Here is what I take away from all of this, and it feels important. The medieval women we've been talking about throughout this series were not merely victims of their circumstances, however difficult those circumstances were. They were not simply oppressed, though they often were. They were people who found pleasure in a well-seasoned bowl of pottage, who argued over cloth at the market, who laughed at jokes, who sang while they worked, who dressed with more intention than the law thought they deserved. They were alive in all the ways that people are alive, with an interior life and a social life and small private joys that the historical record almost never thought worth preserving. And yet, they left traces in the sumptuary laws that tried and failed to keep them from wearing what they wanted, in the complaints about their singing, in the court records of their transactions and disputes, in the recipes that carried their knowledge forward into cookbooks, in the very fact that the word spinster preserves, if you look carefully enough, the memory of the work their hands did every single day. They were here. They cooked and wore and laughed and dressed and argued. The world around them worked very hard to make them invisible, and they kept showing up anyway. There is one more piece of this story left to tell, and it is the one that changes the shape of everything we have discussed. Because we have been talking about the women of medieval England as they existed inside that world. But then something happened that shook the entire structure, something that killed a third of England's population in less than 3 years, something that left the medieval order of things permanently altered, and something that briefly opened doors for women that had been firmly closed before. The Black Death changed everything, including what it meant to be a woman in England, and understanding how and why those doors opened, and why they closed again so quickly, is the final chapter in the story of who these women were. Imagine waking up one morning in the summer of 1348. The village around you is the same as it has always been. The same houses, the same fields, the same neighbours you have known your whole life. Your routine stretches ahead of you exactly as it has for years. The fire to start the animals, to feed the pottage, to make the work that never ends. By the end of that year, half the people in that village might be dead. This is the scale of what the Black Death did to England. And understanding what it meant for women genuinely specifically in ways that were different from what it meant for men is one of the most revealing and most complicated questions you can ask about this period. Because the answer is not the simple story. It is not catastrophe-struck labour became scarce. Women suddenly gained power. It is something far more nuanced, far more human, and ultimately far more honest about how change actually works and who it actually serves. Let us start with the scale of the catastrophe itself, because without that nothing else makes sense. The Black Death arrived in England in the late summer of 1348, almost certainly through the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset, a trading town, a point of contact with the continent where ships brought goods, and on this occasion something else. By the time the first wave had run its course, between 1/3 and 45% of England's population was dead. Some areas were hit harder than others. Some villages lost 2/3 of their inhabitants. The city of London, dense and connected and permanently in contact with the rest of the country, was devastated. The chronicler of Rochester Cathedral wrote that the plague removed people from human concerns in the course of a morning. That is not literary exaggeration. That is what witnesses watched happen. And then the plague came back. Not once, but repeatedly in 1361, in 1369, in 1375. By the 1370s, England's population had been cut roughly in half from its pre-plague levels. The country that emerged from those decades was in almost every measurable way a different country. About 5.5 million people before, around 2.5 million after, and then what? The standard story goes like this. Labour becomes scarce. Labour becomes valuable, workers gain power. And in broad outline for men, that story is essentially true. Wages in England rose dramatically in the years following the Black Death. Nominally, that is, in actual coin mail casual wages, rose between 12 and 28% in the decade after the plague hit. In some areas, individual wages during the plague year itself increased by 50 or 60% almost overnight, as landowners desperate for workers competed to attract the surviving labourers. A ploughman, who'd been earning 2 shillings a week before the plague, was demanding 10 shillings by 1350. The entire economic order that had been built on an oversupply of desperate landless people suddenly had no foundation. The peasant who had been chained to one strip of land, accepting whatever terms the Lord offered, because there was no alternative, that person now had options, could walk to the next village and find someone willing to pay more. The feudal system's grip was cracking from the bottom up. For the men who survived this was a genuine and unprecedented expansion of economic power. And for women, here is where the history gets genuinely complicated, and where I think we need to be careful about both the older and the newer versions of the story. The older Romantic version claimed that the Black Death was a liberation for women, that with so many men dead, women stepped into their roles, took over their trades, inherited their lands, and achieved a kind of temporary equality that history had never given them before. The newer, more careful scholarship, particularly research by historian Jane Humphreys and her colleagues who have analysed detailed wage data for women across the medieval period, tells a significantly more sobering story. When you actually look at the numbers, women's wages did not rise in the same dramatic way that men's wages did. The gap between what men and women were paid for similar agricultural work actually persisted, and in some measures widened after the plague. Women were disproportionately pushed into long-term annual contracts, which, as we discussed in earlier parts of this series, paid less than casual day labour. The Ordinance of Labourers in 1349 and the Statute of Labourers in 1351, the emergency legislation that tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, seems to have affected women particularly harshly, pressing them into fixed employment and restricting their mobility even more than men's. In other words, the labour shortage created by the Black Death was addressed at the institutional level, partly by increasing the control of women workers. The doors that opened for men opened less fully for women, and sometimes they were pushed further shut. That is not the story popular history usually tells, but it is what the evidence shows. And yet the story is not simply one of no change for women, because some things did shift, and they shifted in ways that mattered. Start with inheritance. The Black Death killed indiscriminately, it did not preferentially spare male heirs. When families were devastated by the plague, when father and brothers died, and the only surviving member of a family was a daughter, the inheritance, the land, the house, the position in the community had to go somewhere. It went to her. Across England, in the years and decades after the Black Death, the proportion of women who appear in records as landholders, as tenants, as independent actors in the manorial economy rose. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Historian Caroline Barron, one of the most careful scholars of medieval London women, described the period roughly between 1350 and 1400 as something approaching a golden age for women in London specifically. Widows who had inherited their husbands' businesses were operating those businesses. Women in the silk trade, the textile trades, the victualling trades were appearing in records with a frequency and an independence that was genuinely new. The legal mechanisms, coverture, guild exclusions, wage discrimination were still in place. But in practice, with fewer men to fill the roles, women were filling them. And some of those women knew exactly what they were doing. There is a particular category of widow in the records of post-plague London who negotiated her husband's debts, managed the transition of his business, trained the apprentices, and then continued operating the enterprise for years or decades under her own authority. Not because the law had changed, but because the world had, and she moved into the space that the change had opened. But I want to dwell for a moment on a different kind of change, one that is harder to measure than wages or inheritance records, but that I think was in some ways more profound. The Black Death did not just change the economy, it changed how people thought about death, about the church, about authority, about the relationship between individual human beings and the institutions that governed their lives. Before the plague, the Catholic Church had enormous moral authority in England. Its teachings explained the world. Its rituals marked the important moments of life. Its priests were the intermediaries between ordinary people and God. And then the plague arrived, and the priest died alongside everyone else. In some areas, the clergy suffered higher death rates than the general population, because their work required them to be with the sick and dying. In some dioceses, a majority of parish priests died in a single wave. The survivors had to watch the institutional church, which had claimed to speak for God, fail to protect its own members, had to watch the prayers and the rituals and the pilgrimages not prevent the dying, had to rebuild their spiritual lives with whatever survived. What emerged in the aftermath was a more personal, more interior religious culture. Not heretical, not revolutionary, but more intimate. More concerned with individual experience. More open to the idea that the connection between a person and God did not require elaborate institutional mediation. And this is not coincidental to what we discussed in Part 8 about Julian of Norwich, whose theology of direct maternal divine love emerged from exactly this post-plague world. She was 30 years old in 1373, born in 1342. She'd grown up in the world the Black Death made. The intimacy and directness of her theology reflects that world. Now I need to tell you about 1381, about what happened when the structural pressures finally became too much to hold. The Peasants' Revolt. In 1381, tens of thousands of English peasants, men and women, rose in the largest popular uprising England had ever seen. The immediate trigger was a new poll tax, a flat-rate tax per head that fell disproportionately on the poor. But the deeper cause was the accumulated anger of a generation that had watched the post-plague world fail to deliver what seemed like its promise. Wages had risen, yes, but the statute of labourers had tried to suppress them. Freedom had beckoned, but landlords had found new ways to restrict movement. The survivors of the plague had looked at a world with half the people in it and concluded reasonably that they deserved more, and they had been told consistently no. The rebellion swept through Kent and Essex and reached London. The rebels, led by Wat Tyler and others, presented demands to the young King Richard II. They wanted the abolition of serfdom, the right to free movement, the right to sell their labour on their own terms. They wanted, in essence, the economic freedom that the plague had seemed to promise, and the ruling class had worked to deny. Women participated in the Peasants' Revolt. There is no single dramatic story of a female rebel leader to tell, though some women are mentioned in the records of prosecutions afterward having been involved in specific acts. But the point is not one dramatic individual. It is the broader picture. This was a community uprising, and women were part of the community. The grievances that drove people into the streets were grievances that affected women too. The taxes, the labour restrictions, the gap between what the world seemed to offer and what was actually on the table. The revolt was crushed. The king and the nobility had more power, more organisation and more weapons. The promised concessions were withdrawn. The leaders were executed. The specific moment of insurrection failed. But the world did not go back to what it had been. The forces that the Black Death had set in motion the slow erosion of serfdom, the rise in wages over the following decades, the increasing independence of the peasant household, the greater mobility of ordinary people, those continued, slowly, unevenly, over generations. And for women specifically, what did the post-plague world ultimately look like? The honest answer, and I think it is worth saying honestly, even if it is not the dramatic story, is that the structural position of women improved less than the structural position of men. The wages rose more for men than for women. The labour legislation targeted women's mobility more than men's. The guild exclusions that locked women out of the more lucrative trades persisted, and in some cases intensified. The common law that made married women legally invisible remained unchanged. And yet, the medieval English world that emerged by the 15th century was genuinely different from the world that had existed before 1348. It was a world with a more assertive peasantry. A world where the manorial system was visibly weakening. A world where money wages rather than labour services were increasingly how work was compensated. A world where the idea that your birth determined your position for life was just beginning to crack. Women were part of that world. Constrained within it, yes, but present in it, visible in the records in ways they had not been before, operating with a degree of practical independence that the law did not formally sanction, but that reality had made necessary. The historian Judith Bennett, who has devoted her career to understanding medieval women's work, described the pattern she found across several centuries of English history as continuity in the midst of change. The specific tasks changed, the specific opportunities changed, but the fundamental structure, women doing more work for less recognition and less pay, women's labour being essential to the economy while remaining economically marginal to women themselves, that persisted with remarkable consistency. Through plague and recovery, through boom and collapse, through the legal changes and the economic upheavals of the entire medieval period, that continuity is the most important historical fact this series has tried to convey, but I do not want to end this part on a note that feels defeated. Because there is one more thing the Black Death changed, and it is perhaps the most quietly remarkable of all. When you halve a population, the survivors are on average more likely to have been healthy individuals. The weakest members of the community, those already undernourished, already immunocompromised, already living at the margin, died in disproportionate numbers. What was left was in a very grim and terrible sense the more robust. And the generations born after the plague in a country with more land per person, more food per person, higher wages per person, they were physically larger, better nourished, longer lived than the generations before, including women. The skeletal evidence from post-plague burials in England shows women who were on average better nourished and healthier than the pre-plague baseline. Women who are reaching their full physical potential in ways that chronic pre-plague undernutrition had prevented. That seems like a small thing, but I do not think it is. The experience of living in a body that is adequately fed, that has not been ground down from childhood by relentless caloric deficit that changes how you move through the world, what you feel capable of, what you think you deserve, what seems possible. The women who lived in England in the second half of the 14th century were living, many of them, in better bodies than their grandmothers had lived in. Against a background of catastrophic loss and profound suffering, they were in this narrow physical sense slightly more free. We are coming toward the end of this series now. 2 more parts remain, and in the next one we're going to do something that none of the previous parts have done. We're going to ask not what history says about these women, but what they left behind. What traces they pressed into the world that have survived 7 centuries without anyone intending to preserve them. In the words still in our language, in the object pulled from the earth by archaeologists, in the customs so old that we practice them without knowing where they came from, because these women were here. And the question of how we know that and what it means that we know it is the question that changes everything. There is a particular type of entry in the medieval manorial court rolls of England, those handwritten Latin documents recording the small legal transactions and disputes of village life that historians have been slowly and methodically working through for the past several decades. And in those records, once you learn to look for them, you keep finding women, not doing what they were supposed to do. A woman fined for selling ale at the wrong price. A woman fined for verbally confronting a neighbour in a way the court found excessive. A woman who bought corn from outside the city walls without paying the proper tax. A woman who, according to the record, came into the common hall, walked up to a man who had wronged her husband and slapped him across the face in front of witnesses. She was fined 12 pence. He had been fined 12 pence first for attacking her husband. She apparently considered this fair. The name of that woman is recorded Joan, wife of Hugh Wymondeslow Nottingham, 1395. We have her name because she was fined. We have this particular moment of her life because she did something the court thought worth noting down. 7 centuries later, reading about Joan Wymondeslow walking into a government hall and slapping someone because she was angry, I feel something quite specific. Not because she won necessarily, but because she clearly felt that this was something she was entitled to do, that her anger was legitimate, that the wrong had been done and she was going to respond to it in public on the record regardless of the fine. That is the subject of this part of our series. Medieval English women broke rules constantly. They broke small rules and large ones. They challenged authority and they circumvented it. They stood up in public and said things that got them fined, and sometimes did it again and got fined again. They sold things at prices the Lord disapproved of. They argued with neighbours, with officials, with husbands and landlords and priests. They ran businesses when they were not supposed to. They inherited property that the law would rather have given to someone else. They wrote wills, they sued in court, they won cases, and when they did all of this, the court records wrote it down. Not to praise them, obviously, usually to fine them. But the writing down is how we know they existed. This part is about the gap between what the rules said and what women actually did, about the ways that ordinary women in medieval England navigated, resisted, subverted, and sometimes simply ignored the systems designed to contain them, and about what the texture of all that resistance tells us about who these women actually were. Let us start with speech. Because if you wanted to understand what medieval society was most anxious about when it came to women, one of the clearest windows into that anxiety is the legal category of the scold. A common scold, in Latin, a communis rixatrix, was a woman who caused a public nuisance through her speech, who quarrelled loudly with neighbours, who used her voice in ways that disturbed the peace, who said things that the court thought she should not be saying. Now, I want to be careful here because the popular history of the scold sometimes drifts into sensationalism. The scold's bridle, the famous iron cage with a metal plate inserted into the mouth to prevent speech, is often presented as a medieval invention, the go-to punishment for any woman who talked too much. The reality, as is so often the case, is more nuanced and in some ways more interesting. The scold's bridle was primarily a later instrument used mainly in Scotland from the 16th century and in northern England from the 17th. Its use in medieval England specifically was not as extensive as popular accounts suggest. The more common medieval punishment for scolding was the ducking stool, a chair mounted on a long beam over a river or pond in which the convicted scold was plunged into the water. Public, humiliating, uncomfortable, and occasionally dangerous, it was specifically designed to combine physical discomfort with communal spectacle. But here is what is interesting about the scolding laws when you look at the actual court records. The fine was the most common punishment. Not the ducking stool, not the bridle, a fine. A small amount of money paid to the court and then life continued. Historians who have examined the records of late medieval English towns find women prosecuted for scolding repeatedly the same names, appearing in court again and again across multiple years. Being fined, paying the fine, and then apparently going home and continuing to say things that their neighbours objected to, which suggests something important. A substantial number of women who were prosecuted for scolding did not in fact stop. The medieval legal system treated the female voice as a problem to be managed. The women themselves treated the fines as a cost of doing business. And from their perspective, they had a point. If someone in your community was behaving badly, cheating you in trade, treating your family unjustly, spreading rumours that damaged your reputation, you had limited legal recourse. The official courts were slow and expensive and structurally biased against women, but allowed public confrontation in the market square, naming the wrongdoer and stating the grievance for everyone to hear. That worked. That applied social pressure in a way that formal legal processes often did not. The fine was the price of the tool. I want to tell you about the manorial court rolls more broadly, because this is where some of the most surprising evidence about medieval women's agency lives. The manorial court was the local court of a lord's estate. It handled property transfers, disputes between tenants, enforcement of local customs fines for violations of various rules, and the small-scale legal transactions of everyday village life. Its records, kept in Latin until the early 18th century, carefully inscribed on parchment by the Lord Steward, are among the richest sources we have for medieval social history. And when historians started systematically working through them in the 20th century, they found women everywhere. Not in the roles the official law assigned them, in practice. Free peasant women, it turns out, could and did appear in manorial courts on their own behalf. They sued for unpaid debts. They appeared as witnesses. They brought complaints against neighbours who had damaged their property or defaulted on agreements. They sold and transferred land. They paid fines and received fines. They participated in the legal life of their community in ways that the formal doctrine of coverture, which said married women did not legally exist independently of their husbands, would suggest was impossible. And widows and unmarried women, of course, had even more formal standing, as we discussed in earlier parts. But even married women showed up in ways the law did not anticipate. There is a detail I find particularly revealing in some manorial records. Women appear in business transactions specifically because they were conducting trade independently of their husbands. Not as exceptions noted with surprise, as routine entries. A woman who was running a business recorded in the court rolls fined when something went wrong proceeding with her affairs. The courts found ways to note her existence even when the formal doctrine said she technically did not have an independent legal identity. The gap between the law as written and the law as practiced is one of the central themes of medieval women's history. And in the manorial courts, that gap is wide enough to drive a cart through. Let me tell you about some of the specific women who appear in these records doing things that the rules said they could not do. In Nottingham in 1407 and 1408, the court roll records Alice Brune, Isolde Oseburn, Cecilia Mouldy, Helen Milner and several other women, all labelled as common scolds in the same session. A further 9 women were fined for scolding in the following year's records. But here is the detail that makes this interesting. In the same records, 3 men were also fined for scolding: William Smalley, John Cathorpe, and John Aldrich. The offence was coded as essentially female in the cultural imagination, but in practice both men and women could be charged with it. What the records show is that the category existed to manage anyone of any gender who was considered to be using speech in socially disruptive ways. The focus on women as scolds was partly a cultural phenomenon, partly a practical one. Women had fewer formal mechanisms for addressing grievances, so informal public speech was a tool they used more often. From the same Nottingham records we have Alice, wife of John Tyler, fined for attacking John Leyburn, and Margaret Gay fined 12 pence for injuring William Leadenham by, and this is the specific detail, throwing him against a post. Margaret Gay, a medieval Englishwoman, got into a dispute with a man named William Leadenham and resolved it by physically throwing him into a post. I do not know what William Leadenham had done, but the court record makes clear that Margaret Gay thought he deserved it. Women in medieval manorial court records fought. They argued. They slapped. They brought knives to disputes. The legal records of late medieval English towns contain women showing up armed, accusing others, defending their households and their reputations with the means available to them, and accepting the consequences without, in many cases, apparent regret. Now I want to talk about something different: the women who worked the system rather than defying it. Because resistance to an unjust structure takes many forms. The most dramatic form, the public confrontation, the slap, the loud accusation in the market square, is the most visible. But there is another kind of resistance that is quieter and in some ways more effective, finding the gaps in the law and inhabiting them. Medieval women who wanted to conduct business independently had a limited set of tools available. In London and some other English towns, the feme sole merchant status allowed married women to register as independent traders. We discussed in Part 2 how this was used less than historians once thought, but it was used by specific women in specific circumstances who had figured out that it gave them what they needed. Widows who had inherited their husbands' businesses and wanted to keep running them, and who had the resources and connections to enforce their right to do so, found ways to engage the legal system on their own terms, not always successfully, but persistently. There is a deed preserved from medieval London showing a woman buying and selling commercial property on the north side of the Strand in her own name. The deed is in Latin, the language of formal legal instruments, and it records her participation in the property market as a matter of routine business, with her own seal attached to authenticate it. Her seal notably was oval, the shape typically used by women, as opposed to the circular seals used by men. The shape of the seal was itself a statement of identity. She was not pretending to be someone else. She was transacting business as herself visibly female, and the documents record it. That woman's name was Matilda. We do not know much else about her, but her seal exists. Her deed exists. The transaction she made 7 centuries ago is still in the archive. Here is a question I want to sit with for a moment. Why did these women push back? What made them fight, complain, argue, slap, sue, and break the rules in ways that they knew would cost them? I think the answer is something very simple and very human, because the rules were wrong. Because someone has taken something from them or tried to prevent them from doing something reasonable, or had treated them as less than they were, and they noticed, and they had a response. The medieval women who appear in court records as troublemakers, as scolds, as boundary crossers, they are not strange. They are not aberrations. They are people who encountered injustice and decided to push back against it in whatever way was available to them. The fine was the price, the action was the point. I think about the women in these records often not as objects of historical pity, not as victims, but as people with a very clear-eyed assessment of their situation and a willingness to act within it. Joan Wimondeslow walking into the common hall and slapping Thomas Benton, Alice Brown being repeatedly prosecuted for scolding and apparently not stopping, Margaret Gay throwing William Leadenham into a post, Matilda authenticating her property deed with her own oval seal. None of them changed the structure. The law did not reform itself because of what they did. The legal subordination of married women was not abolished until the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, roughly 5 centuries after the women in these records were living their lives. The scold's bridle is not abolished as a category of offence in England until 1967. But these women were not fighting for a legal reform they would never see. They were fighting for something more immediate, for their specific grievance to be heard, for their specific situation to be addressed, for the person who had wronged them to know that they had been noticed, for the community around them to know that this woman was not going to accept it quietly. That is not nothing. That is in fact a great deal, and the fact that we can still read their names in the records that Joan and Alice and Margaret and Matilda are still there, still visible, still specific, is itself a kind of victory over a system that preferred them invisible. We are in the final part of our series now, part 12, and this is where I want to do something that feels right after 10 parts of looking carefully at constraint, struggle and resistance. I want to ask what these women left behind, not in the formal record, not in the court rolls and the legal documents and the chronicles, but in the world itself, in the language we still speak, in the customs we still practice without knowing where they came from, in the objects that archaeologists are still pulling out of English soil today. Because the most permanent legacy of medieval women's lives is not in the history books, it is in things that were never written down at all, and finding those things, recognizing them for what they are, changes the way you see the world you are already living in. Somewhere in the soil of England right now there is a spindle whorl waiting to be found. It has been there for 700 years, made of lead or clay or carved from a small piece of bone rounded into a disc with a hole through the centre, just large enough to fit a wooden shaft. It was used every day for years, held in the hands of a woman who probably got up before dawn, who brewed the family's ale and fed the chickens and stirred the pottage and went to the fields and came home and started the evening fire, and who in the quiet moments between all of that spun, every spare instant her hands moving with the practised ease of something done so often it no longer required thought, the spindle dropping, turning the thread, pulling out of the fibre in a long continuous line, and then she died. And the spindle whorl was put in the ground with her, because it mattered, because it was hers, because whoever buried her thought she might need it wherever she was going. 700 years later, a metal detectorist or an archaeologist or a construction worker breaking ground for a new building turns up this small heavy disc, this thumb-sized piece of a woman's life, and holds it in their palm, still perfectly round, still smooth where the yarn wore it down over years of use, still bearing the faint impression of the hand that made it. We know that woman existed because of this object, not through any document she wrote, not through any law she appeared in any court record, any chronicle, just this, the thing she made, the thing she used, the thing that was placed in the earth with her as a token of who she had been. This is part 12, the final part of our journey through the lives of medieval women in England, and I want to use it to do something a little different from everything that came before. We have spent 11 parts examining the structures that shaped these women's lives, the laws that constrained them, the work that defined them, the moments when they pushed back, the ways they found to be alive and present and specific within a world that preferred them invisible. Now I want to ask about the after. What did they leave behind? What of their lives is still here, still with us, still recognizable if you know how to look? Because these women did not disappear entirely. They left traces everywhere. Some of those traces are in the obvious places the formal historical record, the manorial court, rolls the convent manuscripts. But the most interesting traces are somewhere else entirely. They are in the language you speak, in the words you use every day without knowing where they came from, in the customs you still practice without knowing what they mean, in the soil of England itself, which is full of small round discs of lead and clay and bone. Let us start with language, because nothing carries history more invisibly than words. You have heard the word spinster throughout this series, and by now you know its origin, a woman who spins. A medieval English woman whose occupation was so constant, so universal, so definitional that her work became her legal identity. The ster ending in spinster is actually one of the oldest feminine suffixes in the English language, a Middle English suffix that specifically indicated a woman performing a trade. Spinster, she who spins. Brewster, she who brews. Baxter, she who bakes. Webster, she who weaves. These are not just words. They are a compressed record of medieval women's working lives preserved in the English language simply because the suffix got attached before anyone thought to change it. When you hear someone called a spinster today in that derogatory, pitying sense of an older unmarried woman, you are hearing a word that has been weaponized against the very women whose work it originally described. The woman who spun thread was the woman who kept England clothed. The woman who brewed ale kept England hydrated. The woman who baked was providing the foundational food of every household. And somewhere along the way those occupational words became insults. The transformation is not accidental. It is a specific historical process when women are displaced from an industry. The word for what they did gets repurposed as a negative term. The work is forgotten. The denigration remains. Distaff is another one. The distaff was the stick that held the unspun fibre, the first tool in the spinning process, the thing a medieval woman always had with her. It became so associated with women that the distaff side became the standard English expression for the female line of a family. When you refer to something as being on the distaff side, you're using a 700-year-old metaphor rooted in the image of a medieval woman walking through a field with a stick of fibre in her hand, spinning as she went. Gossip. We touched on this earlier, but it deserves its full moment. The word comes from Old English godsib, your godparent, someone spiritually bonded to you at baptism. By the medieval period, it had expanded to mean simply a close female friend, a neighbour, someone you trusted. The gossips who gathered in the birthing room during labour, those women were performing a vital communal function. The word that described them became over time a pejorative for women talking too much. The transformation from trusted female community member to idle female chatter is itself a piece of history about how medieval attitudes toward women's speech were encoded into the language and carried forward into our own time. Hussy. You might not know this one. It comes from huswife, housewife, the competent manager of a medieval household, a woman who ran a farm or a cottage economy with skill and efficiency. Hussy as an insult is housewife, as a slur, the same transformation, the same pattern. Now let us go deeper. Beyond words, into objects. Archaeologists in England find spindle whorls constantly. They are among the most common artefacts recovered from medieval sites. Thousands of them are registered in the Portable Antiquities Scheme, the national database of archaeological finds in England and Wales, and thousands more have been found and logged from formal excavations of medieval towns and villages. The whorls are made of many things: lead, clay, bone, stone, jet, even amber for the ones that belong to wealthier women. They range in size from tiny delicate pieces to substantial heavy weights, designed for thick yarn. Some are plain, just functional little discs. Some are decorated, inscribed with crosses or flowers or geometric patterns, or letters that might be the maker's mark or the owner's initial. Each one was someone's. Each one was held. Each one has wear marks where the yarn passed through the hole at its centre, smoothed by the friction of use over years and years and years. And when you hold one in your hand, which you can do in many English museums, you are holding something that a medieval woman held. Not a representation of her life, the actual object, the thing her hands touched every day, the weight and texture of her working hours still there in the clay or the lead perfectly preserved. I find this almost unbearably intimate. More than any document, more than any court record, more than any legal analysis of coverture or inheritance rights, or wage differentials, holding a spindle whorl connects you to a specific medieval woman in a way that is immediate and physical and undeniable. She existed. Her work existed. The object that enabled that work existed. And it is still here. Have you ever wondered where some of our most familiar customs came from? Some of them led straight back to the world we've been exploring. The tradition of women keeping their maiden names as a middle name when they marry a relatively modern practice, but one that reaches back to medieval concerns about female identity and inheritance. The oval seal used by medieval women to authenticate legal documents, the shape that distinguished women's authority from men's in the formal record, and that survived into modern use as the standard shape for certain types of official stamps. The wearing of a ring to indicate marital status, medieval in origin, partly an echo of the ring of keys that signified a lady's authority in her own household. The very structure of the English week carries traces of medieval women's lives. St. Distaff's Day, the 7th of January. The day after Twelfth Night was the day medieval women were expected to resume their spinning after the long Christmas holidays. It was not a formal feast day. It was simply understood the holiday is over. The distaff comes back out, the work continues. There are medieval poems about this day that have a kind of weary humour to the men trying to get their wives back to work, women holding out for one more day of rest. The ordinariness of it and the recognition of ordinariness in the poems feels very human. There is a particular category of medieval women whose traces are most abundant in the English record and whose presence I want to acknowledge specifically as we close this series. The ordinary ones, not Julian of Norwich, not Agnes Devesie, not Alice de Lacy, not even the women who appear in court records because they slapped someone or sold ale at the wrong price. The women who never did anything remarkable enough to attract official notice, whose names appear, if at all, only in passing, as a wife mentioned in a husband's will, as a mother recorded at a baptism, as a tenant listed in an estate survey. Historians like Barbara Hannawalt and Judith Bennett have spent careers trying to reconstruct the lives of these women from the fragmentary evidence that remains. And the picture that emerges is of people who were in the fullest, most uncondescending sense of the word ordinary. Not extraordinary, not heroic, not tragic. People who got up and did what needed to be done and went to sleep and got up and did it again. Who loved their children and sometimes quarrelled with their neighbours, and sometimes found small moments of pleasure in a ripe strawberry, or a song sung while spinning. Who kept the household and the farm and the community functioning. Who were in the truest sense the ground on which everything else was built. These women are invisible in the grand narrative of medieval history, which is a narrative of kings and wars and plagues and religious transformations. But if you look carefully, if you read the manorial court rolls, if you examine the wills, if you visit the archaeological collections and hold the small objects that were buried with ordinary people in the earth of England, they are everywhere. Their names are there sometimes: Emma, Alice, Marjorie, Joan, Agnes, Cecilia, Isabella, Matilda. Their work is there in the wear marks on the tools. Their voices are there very faintly in the fines levied against them for saying things they should not have said and refusing to stop. They were here, and the world they built, the food, the cloth, the ale, the managed households and tended children and harvested fields, is still the foundation of every world that came after. So what do we take away from all of this? We have spent 12 parts together in the world of medieval England, looking at women's lives from almost every angle available to us. We have seen the legal machinery that made them invisible, and the practical reality that made them essential. We've seen how the world was designed to contain them, and how with remarkable consistency across centuries they refuse to be entirely contained. We have seen grief and humour and hard work and small pleasures and moments of genuine intellectual courage. And if there is one thing I keep coming back to, one observation that feels like it underlies all the others, it is this: the story of medieval women in England is not a story of victims. It is a story of people living inside a profoundly unjust structure and doing so with a full range of human responses: acceptance, adaptation, resistance, creativity, humour, anger, love. The structure was real. The injustice was real. But so were the people inside it in all their complicated, irreducible humanness. Julian of Norwich wrote in her small cell in Norwich that all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. She wrote this in the middle of the plague, the poverty, the political upheaval of 14th century England. She wrote it having thought carefully about suffering, and come to a conclusion that was not denial, but something more profound, a conviction that the love underlying the universe was larger than the damage done to it. I think about that when I think about these women, not because I believe everything worked out well for them, it often did not, but because there is something in the way they lived, the way they got up before dawn, and started the fire and kept things going and found moments of connection and beauty in a difficult world that earns the word resilient more honestly than almost anything else I have encountered in history. They carried the weight. They kept the thread running. They held the whole thing together, mostly without credit sometimes, without even names in the record. and in the soil of England, in the words we still speak, in the traditions we still practice without quite knowing why they're still here. Thank you genuinely from the bottom of my heart for spending this entire series with me. 12 parts is a long time to sit with one story, and you stayed. That means everything. If any part of this touched something in you, if you found yourself thinking about Joan Wimondeslow walking into that common hall, or Julian of Norwich in her small room reaching for the word that fit the size of what she wanted to say, or any of the unnamed women whose spindle whorls are still turning up in the earth of England centuries after their hands last touched them, then something real happened here. History is not just information. It is the recognition that other people were fully alive in ways that matter to us now. The comment section is open, and I would genuinely love to know which of these women stayed with you. Which part surprised you most? Which piece of this story you're going to carry with you? If you have watched this far and you have not yet subscribed, now is the time. Because the story does not stop here. There are more quiet lives waiting to be told, more rooms that history has not looked into carefully enough, more small objects in the earth still bearing the marks of the hands that made them. We're just getting started, and the next one, I promise you, is going to be worth the wait.